Oh, there we go. All right, things should be working now. I had to do some stuff with my computer, and everything decided to malfunction simultaneously. So you'll see that I'm on a really bad webcam. My webcam was like, yeah, I don't work anymore. So uh, at least there's another crappy old webcam I could use. And then the problems with the microphone, problem with the headphones, problem with browsers, just all the problems simultaneously. Oh, what a way to start. Okay, so since I deleted the other stream and started this one, it's probably going to take it a couple minutes for people to notice, but I still exist. I'm here. I'm doing this. Let's see where we're at today. Now I'm covering the official topic is a blog post that I wrote some time ago. So let me pull that up. I'll throw that in the chat. Ah, that's why, because it has a different thumbnail than the one I used for this video. Yeah, so technical issues, they get you. So let's see. People should be showing up. And since everything has been going wrong, can you let me know in the chat if you could hear me too? We'll just make sure everything is in working order. This webcam is bothering me, just the terrible quality. Okay, so I'm not going to waste time blathering about nonsense. So I asked today, and well, I should say, the big thing right now going on in philosophy world is apparently, in fact, let me just pull it up and then we'll talk about it. So basically what there was is this letter. Oh, great. Thank you for letting me know. So Supercritical Snake says, sounds good. So I don't know if you've seen, but there was this sort of open letter that a bunch of people signed. I believe it was scientists. Let me see if I could find a decent article that's covering this. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, wasn't really planning on covering this, but it's going on, so I might as well mention it. So basically, there was a big open letter. A bunch of people signed it, saying that integrated information theory is pseudoscience, and now that has caused a big sort of a row in philosophy of mind, I guess you could say, and consciousness studies, and people are arguing about it, and people are throwing remarks all around. There's quite a bit of acrimonious back and forth, and the whole thing is, it's unfortunate. I don't have any kind of interesting hot take on it, but what I did do is sort of jump on the topical bandwagon, and I posed a question in the community chat here, which is whether P zombies are conceivable. So that might sound super weird if you're not familiar with that sort of terminology and what the implications of that might be. So a P zombie, that's just short for a philosophical zombie. This is not a zombie like in The Walking Dead. It's not an undead person that is like no longer alive, but like the body is animated and there's some degree of cognition, but not very much, and they just hunger for brains or whatever, and they shamble around and they decay and they look very much like a Walking Dead person. Hence, the TV show The Walking Dead. It's not that kind of zombie. It's not like a magical or science fiction-y kind of zombie. A philosophical zombie is a lot less gross, I guess you could say, and concerning, because if you're kind of one of those zombies, they're going to want to eat your brain. A philosophical zombie is a person, or you might even say they're not technically a person once I describe their characteristics. A philosophical zombie is physically identical to you or to me in every respect. So you could in fact take a person like me. There could be and a philosophical zombie would be an exact copy of me down to the microphysical structure at every possible degree of detail. It's not different in any physically detectable way. So it's just like me, all the same atoms in all the same places and all the same configurations. Physical configuration, you could imagine that it would be saying and doing stuff like I'm doing right now. Like it would talk to you. You could have a conversation with this P zombie. And yet, in spite of being physically identical, it has no phenomenal consciousness at all. It's not conscious. It has no conscious experiences. There's nothing it's like to be that sort of being. You just basically have a body and a brain, and it's going around doing stuff. In fact, it could even be a philosopher of consciousness and could go around saying stuff like, well, of course I'm conscious. Of course I have phenomenal consciousness. I've got qualia. And yet it's wrong. It doesn't really have qualia. It's just saying things that are not true. So that's a p-zombie. And then the question is, are p-zombies conceivable? Could you imagine a p-zombie? Or could you conceive of a p-zombie if someone wants to get really pedantic and say that there's a technical distinction between those? So, someone in the chat says same brain configuration. Yes. So the brain, you couldn't tell the difference between the two brains. Same laws of physics. I don't know. I'm gonna say yes. I'm not sure if p-zombie proponents would say that there could be different laws of physics. So the answer to that is I'm not entirely sure. We could look at an exact description of a zombie. In fact, let's do that. There is a Stanford Encyclopedia entry article. Let's pop it open and have a look. So I'll throw a link to that in the chat. Check it out. Stanford Zombies. Boom. There you go. Let's see if we have an idea, a description of the zombie. I'm trying to get, yeah, so a big question there, section number 4, are zombies conceivable? And that's a big argument. I'm just trying to get where in here is a description of what a p-zombie is. Well, we could just read the intro. So it says, zombies in philosophy are imaginary creatures designed to illuminate problems about consciousness and its relation to the physical world. Unlike the ones in films or witchcraft, they are exactly like us in all physical respects, but without conscious experience. By definition, there is nothing it is like to be a zombie. Yet zombies behave just like us, and some even spend a lot of time discussing consciousness. So that is the idea. Let me see if there's, I don't see if there's any, I'm not seeing a quote that's like laying out exactly what like Chalmers says a zombie is. So here's the key part. I remember seeing this part of the entry, so this will be good enough for our purposes. If zombies are, sorry, and I should say what section this is in. So this is the second to last paragraph in section 1, the idea of zombies. If zombies are to be counterexamples to physicalism, it is not enough for them to be behaviorally and functionally like normal human beings. Plenty of physicalists accept that merely behavioral or functional duplicates of ourselves might lack qualia. Zombies must be like normal human beings in all physical respects, and they must have the physical properties that physicalists suppose we have. This requires them to be subject to the causal closure of the physical, which is why their supposed lack of consciousness is a challenge to physicalism. If instead they were to be conceived of as creatures whose behavior could not be explained physically, physicalists would have no reason to bother with the idea. There's plenty of evidence that, as epiphenomenalists hold, our movements actually are explicable in physical terms. So there you go. That answers your question. So same subject, like are they subject to physics in the same way? Yes. That's what it appears to be the case. So yeah. And then the question is, are they conceivable? So that's the question I posed. I actually haven't looked at your answers yet. So let's have a look. It looks like we got 87 votes. That's pretty good for just 7 hours ago. 33% with yes, 25% with no, and 41% for I don't know. I liked including an I don't know answer in there. Okay, so I don't talk about it quite as much, but it is a topic that's of some interest to me. The question of consciousness. Now, my own view on this would be that philosophical zombies are not conceivable. Now, there is a question of, well, what's meant by conceivable? And the answer is, I'm not really sure what people that say zombies are conceivable mean or have in mind. And I'm not sure that they have anything in mind that's particularly robust. So typically, I think that a lot of philosophical concepts are underdeveloped, and philosophers love to invoke concepts that seem to me to encroach on psychology and cognitive science more broadly, but without offering what strikes me as a particularly substantive account of what it is they take themselves to be doing, how they know they can do it. So someone can say, I can conceive of this. What exactly are they doing? So when someone says they can conceive of a p-zombie, so they're claiming that they're capable of conceiving of a person who is physically identical to you or to me, in all possible respects, but that person's not conscious. They can imagine that. Now, what is, or conceive of that if we want to be really pedantic. What are they conceiving of? Like, someone could conceive of something like the following two statements. Person is physically identical to me in every possible respect. Person is not phenomenally conscious. And then they just think of the conjunction of those two sentences. And they're like, yeah, I could think of the conjunction of those. And I could imagine a little T at the end of it. It's true. I can imagine that being true. Is that what they're doing? Is it just the, smashing together two propositions and then just assigning true to them, regardless of what the hell that means? Because like I could do that for any contradictory claims even. In fact, I could do it for complete gibberish. So you could just take like the Jabberwocky and say, "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves. I don't know how to pronounce it because they're fake words. Did gyring gimble in the wabe?" Yeah, I'll assign true to both statements, so the conjunction of them is true. Yeah, true. I can imagine that being true. I can imagine that means something, and that what it means turns out to be true. So, like, those are nonsense phrases. So, what are you imagining is true? Are you just imagining these as some sort of symbolic operators in some logic test, and you're told to assign a true value to them for some reason? Or you're writing up a truth table, and you're like, yeah, one of the possibilities is that both of the parts of both parts of the conjunct are true. So, yeah, the whole statement is true. Are you doing that? Because I can imagine that, but then I can imagine the sentence, "There are lots of square circles all over the place," is true. I can imagine the sentence and just assign a truth value to it. So it's got to be more than that. So what the hell are they doing? So I don't. Maybe there's more like because like if you tell me to picture a cat, what exactly is going on when I do that? Right. So am I imagining a cat in full detail? I remember Dennett giving an example like this. So you could the thought experiment will go something like this. Well, I shouldn't say it's a thought experiment. It's an exercise, a mental imagery exercise. It's a better way of putting it. So imagine a tiger, right? So just picture a tiger as vividly as you can. Okay. You got the tiger in your mind. All right. So now the question is, what direction is the tiger facing? Is it facing towards you? Is it facing to the left or the right, up, down? Is it two-dimensional or three-dimensional? Is it in color or is it black and white? There's a variety of questions you could ask about the tiger, and you might be able to answer some of those questions. Like, oh yeah, when I imagine a tiger, I'm imagining it looking to the left. Okay. And I picture the legs, the head, the tail. The tail for me is up, so the tail goes up. So there's some details there. So now the question is, how many stripes does it have? Can you count the stripes in your mental image of a tiger? Now I find when I do that, I cannot do so. And a person might think that they have a very vivid image of a tiger in their mind. Okay, so if you have a vivid image of the tiger in your mind, now ask yourself this. So are the stripes going down the back, right? Do they go across the whole tiger, across the tail? And as they come down the legs, do they continue to go straight down, or do they turn and then go around the legs horizontally rather than vertically down, like as they do down the back? So when I try to picture that, I realize that those details were never there, and I could sort of zoom in on the leg and sort of paint in the stripes around the legs, but it's not so clear to me that I was imagining that initially. Rather, I'm sort of constructing the parts of the tiger when prompted to do so as I go along. So it turns out, it might have seemed to me, if I didn't really think about it very much, that if you tell me to picture a tiger vividly, that like I have an image of a tiger in my head, almost like a blurry photograph. And it's got all the detail there. And it's just a question, just as if I was looking at a real tiger. So if I was looking at a real tiger in the zoo, you could say, hey, can you see the tiger? Yeah. Okay. Is it facing left or right? It's facing left. Is it an orange tiger? Yeah, it's orange. Does it have stripes? Yes, it does have stripes. And do they go down the legs? And like, which way did they go to? Oh, yeah. And then I would just look and tell you. But our mental image, was it like that all along? Or when we're prompted, do we start adding features? And when we're adding them, is the image changing? Because what exactly is going on? I think the answer is it's not so obvious from introspecting. And it's not even obvious to me that when people introspect that they're doing that, the same sorts of things are going on, across people. Like some people don't have this kind of mental imagery. So I think that there are quite substantial questions about how our cognitive processes actually operate, and the presumption that everything is available to us in full detail via introspection is simply not true. And this is a point that illusionists about consciousness are fond of emphasizing. Might be made to visual illusions, but there's more than just the kinds of visual illusions, like if you put a pencil in a glass of water and it bends, because of how light refraction works. There's also various aspects of the way visual processing works that are not necessarily obvious to people. So if you look out over a scene, so let's say you're standing on the top of a hill and you're looking out over a landscape and you see a village in the distance and some mountains in the distance, clouds and all that stuff. And you focus in on something. Let's say it's a lighthouse in the distance, and you zoom it. You're looking at that lighthouse. You're focused on it. Now the question would be, in your peripheral vision, is it highly detailed? Is it in color? A lot of people might say yes, it is. At least it seems that way. Now it turns out you're probably wrong if you think that. So everything outside, a very narrow bandwidth of what you're focused on is blurry, and you don't have the kind of people just don't generally have the ability to perceive color with the acuity that it seems to them like they actually have. So when you go around looking at things, you might have this sense that you're sort of, just like if you're looking at a video right now. So like if you're watching this, you actually are literally watching a video right now. So if you paused it and you looked anywhere, there in fact would be detail. Now I'm using a crappy backup camera, so it wouldn't be a lot of detail, but there is like the way that this thing is processing, like the camera is processing the visual, I guess you could say the light input. I mean, it's not an eye. The way it's processing it, it's actually picking up all that input. And you could like pause the screen and look at all the details. Your vision doesn't actually work that way. You're not actually getting all this detail in the periphery. So people are just wrong about how things seem to them. And part of the point of illustrating this in books like Consciousness Explained and other sorts of work that talk about consciousness is that some features of our introspection are reliable. They tell us what things are really like, and they're pretty accurate. Some of them, not so much. And it takes a lot of difficult empirical work to sort out what is and isn't really going on, and how the sorts of systems, the sensory systems, and how general processing, outside of just direct sensory processing, how the brain processes information is not obvious upon introspection. And yet, many philosophers put an enormous amount of stock in their quote unquote seemings, their intuitions, their judgments about things, without having a good sense of, I guess you could say, the sort of mechanistic provenance of those systems. So, when they make moral judgments, you might have someone say, well, our judgments are generally reliable, our intuitions are generally reliable. Yeah, like my visual system is generally reliable. Are moral judgments generally reliable? I don't know. Or should we infer that because vision is generally reliable, therefore moral judgments are also likely to be generally reliable? Well, the brain isn't just one big single system. It's a bunch of interconnected systems and mechanisms that are operating with different protocols, I guess you could say. They receive different inputs, they process that information in different ways, and they deliver different sorts of outputs. It's not just one big system where if part of it works, the whole thing works. You have to look at, well, what systems are active in any given context, and in the case of a moral judgment, what's actually going on? What types of information are resulting in the outputs of a moral judgment? And are the systems processing that information reliable? Are those good systems? Are they like the visual system? Are they like the olfactory system? Shouldn't this matter? Are we just going to act like the way in which brains mediate information is not relevant? That seems really strange. So, an example you might be able to consider would be, I open up my phone. I got an app on it. I go to the calculator app. I punch in some numbers. I keep testing it. I do the math by hand, or I have, I ask a bunch of mathematicians, and the calculator is like really accurate. It gets it right pretty much every time. Maybe it throws an error once in a while if I do something weird. Usually that's going to be my error, so it's not actually malfunctioning. So I do all that. The calculator is really accurate. Does that mean some other app that you have is going to give you accurate information about the world? What if you have a horoscope app that's telling you your sign and you're a Gemini and it says that today you're going to have this happen? Oh, well, the calculator app works. Therefore, your horoscope app is going to work. Well, of course not. Just because the phone is one object doesn't mean that and just because some of the apps on the phone work well and provide accurate information doesn't mean all of the apps work well. Now, what's the point of the analogy? Well, the brain isn't one app. It's I mean, it's not quite as autonomous as the way apps in a phone might work, but the systems in the brain can operate semi-independently of one another. A person can be reliable on one subject, but not reliable on another subject. They could have one type of sensory maybe through some drug interference or, I don't know, we use transcranial magnetic stimulation and we I don't know, disrupt some system in the brain without disrupting another system. And so a person can be really unreliable on one topic and not really, remain really reliable on another. And so these systems can operate at least somewhat semi-independently of one another. And so it's a little strange to presume that if some of these systems tend to work on average, that therefore your judgments in some completely different domain are also likely to be reliable. Why? How do you know? You might make a claim like, well, most of the systems that we operate on are generally reliable. Therefore, some other system it stands to reason would be generally reliable. That might even be true, but that's an extremely weak inductive claim. You're like, vision, smell, taste, hearing, they tend to be pretty reliable. So probably our moral judgments are reliable. Yeah, okay. So that's a bit of inductive evidence that maybe moral judgments are reliable. And if you have these judgments that seem to be delivering you this sense that moral realism is true or whatever, okay, fine. That's a bit of evidence. It's not very good evidence. Okay, let me pop into the chat and see what's going on here. Oh, right. Sebastian A says, it sort of feels like a conceivability. This is in reference to P zombies, which I was talking about a bit ago. It sort of seems like the conceivability of infinity. If someone says they can conceive of an actual infinite, all I have is incredulity. Like, I could be terribly limited, but this sounds bogus. So yeah, I can't conceive of infinity, but I've given mathematical, like I can't imagine a 100-sided polygon or something like that. And I've had some people tell me, oh, well, maybe some mathematicians actually have a pretty good way of visualizing or representing or imagining this sort of thing. And so maybe they can. And that actually does, I don't know, but that doesn't strike me as like obviously completely implausible that maybe a person with specialized training can imagine things I can't imagine. I imagine an architect could imagine a house blueprint much more effectively than I could. So, depending on your training, skills, and expertise, yeah, sure. Like, for instance, maybe a chef can do a better job of sort of like simulating what a flavor, like what if we mix basil and amaretto or something? That doesn't sound good. But I was just coming up with whatever came to my mind first. You mix those things and they can imagine, yeah, it would taste like this. Now, sometimes when you mix flavors, you actually get something you didn't expect, like the flavors synergize in a strange way. Maybe sometimes that's due to some chemical interaction with the ingredients. So maybe it's not something you could imagine a priori. And maybe chefs aren't that good at this, but I imagine they're probably better than me, right? So at the very least, or here would be an example. Expert chess players can imagine, a game, like they don't even need a board in front of them to play a game. I would really struggle. Probably wouldn't be able to do that without some practice and training. So people don't all have the same cognitive capacities as one another due to specialized training in their hobbies and activities and careers and subjects that they study and whatever. So you have that. So there are going to be differences between people, but some questions you might ask. Okay, can a person imagine? I don't know if there are like a million-sided polygon. Can a person imagine that? Can someone imagine a complete and perfectly accurate topographical map of the United States? Can a person imagine a square circle? Can someone imagine an invisible pink object? What is that? How is it pink and invisible? Can a person, stuff I wonder about is whether people can really imagine some of the thought experiments that people give in philosophy. So can you imagine Parfit's repugnant conclusion? I don't think that I can. So philosophers will just say, I can imagine it, but I don't know what they're doing. And I also don't know if I don't think they know what they're doing. Sorry, I'm unreasonably thirsty. I don't know why. So yeah, I'm sympathetic to that sort of concern. Antonio Vitalone says, from both Lance and Sebastian's points, it seems to me that the conclusion is that there are many different ways of conceiving, and perhaps even different levels of even different level of conceivability. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, this is. I'm always happy to break things down and say, okay, let's talk about the 6 kinds of conceivability. But you know, it's not a literature I read, so I don't really know. Going through the chat, okay, yeah, people talking to each other. All right, that's not really the topic that I wanted to talk about today. I don't know if I want to read off this blog post. It's kind of long. Yeah, I don't think I want to. So, and this might be a pretty short feed today. I don't know. I'm not. Something about all the technical issues, and I don't know. Just maybe lately, I'm just feeling especially tired and burnt out. It's. I don't know. So I don't feel that urge to like really rail against moral realism right now. I'm not feeling it. So does anyone have questions for me or any stuff you want to talk about? So feel free to just put them in the chat. Do ping me. It's easier for me to see them if you do that. So like, do at and select me. What is going on? So I do have a paper that's out as a preprint. Let me put that in the chat. Has anybody seen that? I'll pull that up. So this is a co-authored paper with my colleagues. I'll put that in the chat. Maybe I should do a week where I just talk about the paper. That would be cool. I wasn't planning on doing that, so I'm not ready to talk about it now. Give me a second and I will post that paper. Maybe it's just one of those days where I need to be ready, fix all the technical issues, and then do this again. Maybe I'll do another one tomorrow. Cool, here it is. Well, the paper, this is just a preprint, so we're still working on getting this published. But you can check that out. So what that is, you'll see there is a thread. In fact, I could just go through the thread. Maybe that's worth doing because it summarizes what's in the paper. And it should be just accessible to everybody. So you can certainly check the paper out. Okay. Let's do that. Why not? I get to do what I want. It's my stream. All right, let's do it. New preprint, Signaling Intolerance, the Reputational Implications of Metaethical Relativism and Objectivism by David Moss, Andreas Montalegre, Lance Bush, Lucius Caviola, and David Pizarro. So we propose a novel and this is, I'm just reading the set of tweets from Andreas who wrote this up. So thank you, Andreas, for doing that. I appreciate, getting this stuff out there. Great. Okay, so let's do it. We propose a novel reputational account to explain variation in metaethical judgments. Prior research has shown that people don't consistently view morality as objective or relative. Instead, their metaethical judgments can vary widely based on the specific moral issue and the influence of various social factors. In our paper, we present evidence supporting a new perspective on the social function of metaethical judgments to explain this phenomena. Metaethical judgments serve to signal tolerance or intolerance towards disagreement. We propose that signaling relativism offers reputational advantages in situations of disagreement, while signaling objectivism offers advantages in situations of agreement. In study 1, we find that compared to objectivists, relativists are perceived as more tolerant, empathic, to have superior moral character, and to be more desirable as social partners. In study 2, we replicate these findings within participants' design and also show that, despite these reputational costs, objectivists are perceived as more morally serious. In study 3, using a novel pretested database of 44 moral issues, we examine evaluations of people who expressed objectivism or relativism concerning concrete moral issues. in situations where the person either agreed or disagreed with their counterparts' views about these issues. This study replicated our prior results and demonstrated that the effects sometimes differed substantially across conditions of agreement and disagreement. In some cases, we found that these results vary dramatically based on the moral issue. In other cases, the results were consistent across different moral issues. These findings suggest that there are important social implications to expressing different metaethical stances in different contexts, and that sensitivity to these implications may explain the observed variation in metaethical judgments. All right, so that's the paper. And part of what this is getting at is some of what I talk about in my dissertation. And so most of the dissertation is dedicated to showing that existing measures, like existing methods to measure how people think about moral realism and anti-realism, are probably not valid. And my basis for thinking that has to do with a combination of multiple choice and open response questions. And I think I have a couple other methods in there, but it's mostly those two. So basically what I show is that a substantial majority of participants systematically interpret questions about metaethics in unintended ways, or at least fail to demonstrate that they clearly interpreted them in intended ways. What this means is that if you give, say, 100 people a question and that's intended to determine whether or not that person is a moral realist or speaks or thinks like a moral realist or whatever, that only a small proportion of those people, when asked to explain why they answered the question the way that they did, or what they think the question is asking them, what they think a response to that question would indicate about a person's beliefs or attitudes. The goal here would ideally be for people to readily be able to convey that what their own metaethical view is, or what the question is asking them, or what a response to the question would mean. For instance, if a person gives a relativist response to a question about metaethics, people should be able to pick up on that if it's a valid measure and report that. Now, of course, it's possible people have some inchoate, underdeveloped sense of the terms that's implicit, the concepts, but they don't have the terminology. And so they wouldn't say, well, the person's a moral realist. Like, why? They're not going to know the language. But they may or may not be able to respond in a way where they could even implicitly indicate that they have some sense of what the questions are really getting at. So what will happen if you ask that question to like 100 people, a question intended to figure out whether the person interpreted the question to be about realism or not, is you might only get 5 or 10 people that would say, yeah, this question is asking me if I think like murder would still be wrong, even if everybody didn't think it was wrong. So that would be see, there's no technical language there. And yet many people, what I find across many, many different measures and many ways of asking, do not interpret these questions reliably in a way that would indicate that they interpreted them to be questions about realism and anti-realism. In fact, sometimes it's even reversed. They think a question about realism is about anti-realism, or vice versa, depending on the wording of the question. So they often interpret the question in a variety of other ways. And those other ways they interpret them are completely reasonable ways to interpret these questions. So for instance, this isn't super common, but it's a very clear example you will understand when you see it, is that if you ask people what it means for morality to be objective, or for an action to be objectively true that an action is right or wrong, some people understand objective to mean unbiased, or without in an impartial way. And so they'll see something to be judged to be wrong to be, oh, well, it was judged wrong in an impartial way. But that's not the sense of objectivity that philosophers have in mind. They have in mind something like stance independence. And so if you ask someone directly, do you think there's an objectively true answer to this? Or do you think this is objectively wrong? At least some people will interpret that to be a question about whether it's wrong from a perspective that's unbiased, which is not what the question is asking. Now, that's just one example. And this is more generally a sort of a death by 1,000 cuts, where there's lots and lots of different interpretations of these sorts of questions. Give me 1 second. I see a couple more comments in the chat, and I have to say a couple things real quick. One moment. All right, sorry, I had to take care of something. Supercritical Snake says, you don't want to dunk on moral realists. Who are you and what did you do with Lance? Yeah, maybe I'll work up the energy to do it at some point. I guess I don't know. I'm also really hating how terrible Are you seeing how bad this webcam is? Ugh. I'm gonna buy a new webcam. This is just no. This isn't gonna fly. All right, Jonathan Becker. Good to see you. 1 second. I'm getting. Good to see you, Jonathan Becker. So Jonathan says, I'm behind, but I appreciate the analogy between seemings and apps. Oh, right. Okay. I thought it was an abbreviation for something, and it was my own terminology. I'm behind, but I appreciate the analogy between seemings and apps. People like to appeal to mathematical seemings, and maybe that carries some weight, but why extend that to reified metaphysical seemings? Yeah, good question. I don't know. Kevin says, hey, I am here live. Woohoo. Hey, do you want to come on here and talk now? You're welcome to do it. Just spontaneous. You want to come on and talk? Kevin, you're invited to come talk right now if you want to. All right. We'll see if Kevin wants to join us. And we haven't seen Joe from Majesty of Reason in a while. I think Joe is going to be a little too busy to show up and tell me that I'm suppressing the truth and unrighteousness or something like that. Yeah, but I am going to have to change the title of this. Can I change the title in the middle of the stream? Is that possible? Because I don't think I'm going to get to this topic today. So I keep this topic, for whatever reason, I pushed it off like 4 times. I think I might just do a recorded video for this topic because it's kind of a big topic. 1 second. There's lots of extra stuff going on, but yeah, let me give a link because we're going to have Kevin show up. All right. Hey, how's it going? We got another message. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the link set up. So I hit dead air. I get this sorted. I know it's a live stream and I should be able to be chill, but I'm not. I don't like silence. Okay, Kevin says 5 minutes. All right. Just give me a second. All right. Okay, and I never even sent the link because I'm ridiculous. All right, here's the link. That's just for Kevin, not for the rest of you. Too bad. All right, let's get back to things. All right. So, Cass. Oh, okay. I'm doing my best. Says, hey, Lance, how are you? You know what? Today, I'm not the best. I'm not the best I could be. I feel like I wanted to hit the ground running at 5 and just do my standard thing. And today, I don't know. It's an off day for me. But instead of just going and getting all grumpy and canceling the stream and going and doing something else, I'm sticking it out. And it's like when you go to the gym and you get there and you're like, I don't want to do this, and you just got to get into it and just wait until, like, I don't know, the mind and the body are just like, all right, it's happening. Let's just shut up and do it. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. But yeah, I've increasingly felt a degree of burnout on the arguing about moral realism stuff. It's been years and years and years of this. Now I've only had the channel. We're not quite at a year. We're at 9 months. And what are we at? Because the channel's been growing. And I haven't even been putting out that many videos. So, but I should talk about the last couple of videos if you're mostly here for the streams. So I was on Digital Gnosis with Nathan Orman, and then Nathan came on this channel sort of spontaneously to discuss, is philosophy a waste of time? So you'll see 2 videos on that. One of them was like the sort of original video, and then one's my follow-up video. It's also over 5 hours of us dunking on philosophy. So and that was a couple weeks ago, and then last week I was off again. So that, if you haven't checked those out, they're kind of long, but you might get some decent content there. But yeah, that's been kind of an interest of mine for a while now, is that I'm increasingly concerned about the sort of state of philosophy as a whole. And in part, it's it's frustrating because a lot of people that are critical of academic philosophy are kind of terrible critics. It's often scientists that don't really study or know much about philosophy, don't really have a clue. And they think that philosophy is like, I don't know, sipping a martini and smoking a cigar and saying, here's my view about life. Like, maybe some goofy continental philosophy. I'm not saying all continental philosophy is goofy. I'm saying just that kind of, they're picturing something goofy. And so like there's that. And then there's people that think that philosophers can't or never engage with empirical considerations or just totally have to lunch all the time on everything. They just have misconceptions about what philosophy is and how it works. And I don't like those criticisms, and I don't like getting lumped in with them because I am super critical of the field, but I'm super critical in at least a slightly informed way. I wouldn't say that I'm the most informed person ever by any means, but I've seen enough and I've done enough and I know enough to at least say a little bit of something about my concerns about academic philosophy. And a big part of it is metaphilosophical. All right, Kevin is here. So,
hello.
Hey, so we've been wanting to have a conversation. So we're just having one now.
Yes, this is perfect. I was here live for the first time in a long time, and I believe in striking while the iron is hot, and the iron is hot. So,
all right, yeah. So I hopefully you can help me out here because I'm on a backup webcam, and I'm exhausted. So all these debates have just been wearing me down. And do you get in a lot of philosophical debates?
yeah, honestly, I would kind of like to get into more philosophical debates than I do. But you and I kind of operate in different spheres. So for the audience who doesn't know me, I'm a teeny tiny YouTuber, but I grew up traditionalist Catholic. And so my YouTube channel is dedicated to speaking with other traditionalist Catholics. Traditionalist Catholics are like the evangelicals of the Catholic world. And I think that they make a lot of philosophical mistakes. And it does get tiring, but perhaps the difference between like Lance and I is that I'm doing work trying to kind of de-radicalize people. And I think that Lance's work is a lot more technical, if that makes sense, than my work. Is that would you say that's about right? Like it's far more important for you to be precise than it is for me.
It's more important for me to be precise, but I wouldn't say a lot of the content that I've covered on the channel is as technical as I would like it to be. So one of the big things, a lot of stuff I keep saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. I eventually got to doing a few interviews. I've got a few more. In fact, I have one recorded. I still haven't edited it to upload it. And that's a cool conversation on experimental philosophy, where I talk to someone that does experimental philosophy and we really get into all that stuff. But I don't know. I don't know if people would consider what I talk about here technical. Some of it is, but I feel like a lot of it. So my own approach to a lot of academic philosophy is to try to, I guess you could say, de-jargonize it and de-technify it, because I feel like one of my biggest issues. I mean, look, the original topic for today, I mean, is there too much useless formalism in philosophy? That was the original topic, and I have a blog post about that because, in fact, I'll mention something briefly about that. I get really frustrated when, and I think some people might say, "Oh, well, that's because you're not good at logic," or they'll have their quips about why this might be the case. But sometimes people will say, can you put that in a syllogism?" And like you're having a conversation, and you're like, a lot of times my reaction is, no, I'm not going to put that in a like, because I don't. I mean, for me, it's that I don't think it would be valuable because, for instance, I have this view that certain concepts in that more realist use are not intelligible. And someone might say, give me a syllogism. Okay, so I could give them a syllogism, like it could be, if the terms you're using to convey your concept aren't communicable, then the concepts are meaningless. They're not communicable, therefore the concepts are meaningless. They're just going to reject premise one, and then we end up having a discussion about it, and then we're right back to the discussion we we're having before they forced me to syllogize it. Is that a term, syllogize? It is now.
It is now, yeah.
So it's like putting it into a form like, a modus ponens or something like that could be useful if someone else is having trouble tracking your argument and they're like, I'm not sure what your argument is. Or if you are not quite clear on what your own argument is, it could also be helpful. But it also has substantial downsides, that technicalism and that formalism, which is that if you have a very holistic approach to a question and you're like, look, the reason I endorse this view is basically an abductive consideration of a bunch of different considerations, and you weigh them all in a a way it's not formalized. It's not like I'm like, I put 17% weight on this argument for God and 14%. No one really knows the numbers. So you have all those
Wait.
arguments.
So you're telling me that you don't plug everything into a Bayes spreadsheet in Excel and then base all of your decisions that way? Wait, then how did you decide that the Shroud of Turin isn't literally the burial cloth of Jesus? I have no idea how you're actually doing any of your reasoning now.
Right. So, but some people try, and look, I'm totally on board with people giving it a fair shot to say, look, I'm going to approximate and do some type of Bayesian formalization. I just don't think in every discussion it's strictly necessary, and that you're some kind of stupid idiot if you are unwilling or unable to do it. My concern, though, is not that there isn't a time and place for formalism. Like, there absolutely is. It's just that sometimes what people do is, I think that they throw demands for specificity, clarity, formalism. They're using it as another sort of hurdle. Like, it's like they want you to jump through their dialectical hoops so that if you stumble, they can declare victory. And so what they're trying to do is sort of make you fight on their own terms. Just like some like military strategist that's trying to make you fight on their home territory. It's a way of like throwing you off your stride and saying, look, I'm going to give you these sort of stupid tests. Like, oh, you're trying to make an argument? Okay, formalize it. Oh, you don't want to? It's because you're not good at logic and you're an idiot and you don't know what you're doing. Oh, you formalized it and you screwed up? I guess you're an idiot. So you have to, it's like, what they're doing is they're giving you challenges, and you have to meet all of those challenges. And if you stumble at any point, people usually, they don't give you grace. So if you screw up a formalization of an argument, I would rarely see someone making the demand go, hey, I think you messed up premise 2. This is not a valid argument as structured. You go, oh, yeah, shit, my bad. I let me fix it. It's not even valid. You're a moron. Ha 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 ha, I win.
And in a way, it's religious, the way that they do it, because religious people use the same tactics. Like the trad Catholics will do this, where they'll say, like, if you try to make a critique of Catholicism or something, they'd be like, oh, well, clearly you haven't read Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologia, because, in the Summa Theologica, volume 2, question 54, Thomas addresses this, and clearly you're not familiar with that. Therefore, I'm going to dismiss you. And so it's a tactic that it's not a religious tactic, but it's the same tactic. It's like a gatekeeping tactic that I think the highfalutins in the philosophy schools might use it, and the religious folks use it too, I think.
I rarely see professional philosophers do this. And I think that's because they are formalizing one's arguments, and in the middle of a conversation and a back and forth is usually not the place for it. So I don't think it's in fact, so what I would just say in my experience, and again, it's just an anecdote, is that typically the kinds of people that demand formalization in inappropriate contexts, because there are sometimes when people just say, look, I really just want a formal argument because I'm not sure what you're saying. That is totally legit. I'm not saying that's not okay. It's often just like standard online debates.
Okay. It's the people who are the wannabe PhD philosophers who aren't, but they think that they are, so they go around demanding syllogisms in strange contexts.
Yeah, I don't know that the contexts are strange, and I don't know if I'd also want to say these people are wannabes. I don't know what it is. I wish I had a good concrete example of what I'm talking about, but I don't have one offhand. But there is this, and that's not even really a critique of academic philosophy. That's a critique of sort of the philosopher online, I guess you could say, like the people that discuss philosophy. But there's probably a bunch of overlapping and semi-overlapping different communities. So I don't even know if I'm referring to anybody in particular, but you do get an analog of this in philosophy, which is superfluous formalization. So philosophers might say, suppose you have an object P such that it is in a configuration Q such that blah, 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 it meets condition, Z. And like they'll just start using a bunch of, like, I'm going to use a phi symbol for no reason. So philosophers will do this on occasion too. So I shouldn't let them off the hook. And they'll just formalize shit for no reason. Or just give you unnecessarily bizarre thought experiments. Like, suppose aliens from planet Zorlon arrive and they're all wearing hats. And anyway, so they demand that you give, and you're like, wait, what are the hats about? Or is that relevant? So they'll do that kind of shit. And I guess sometimes it's just to make things fun or funny. but it's distracting.
How much interaction do you have with like the kind of Christian apologetic side of YouTube?
Not much. So this is something I've wanted more interaction because, you know, there's a lot of metaethics discussion there, and I want to have those discussions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know that you're like friendly with Dave Paulman, and so am I. Dave and I are friends, and we go back and forth. You know, Dave is the Christian apologist. And he tags you sometimes on Facebook because I see, I see it on Facebook. He just put out a big video that got him in hot water with like other Christians because he's a moral anti-realist, which is uncommon among Christians.
Correction, he's not technically a moral anti-realist. I think he would say he's a moral non-realist or a skeptic, because he does not endorse anti-realism. He just doesn't endorse realism.
Fair. Okay. Would he say something along the lines of like, maybe like more realism exists and it's grounded in God or something? You just can't use that to prove God? Because I do know that his big contention is that the moral argument's not a good argument. The moral argument for the existence of God.
I think what he would say, it's too bad we can't just ask him immediately. I mean,
Let's pull him in here. It's a party.
So I think his general stance is that he does not think that there's a compelling case for moral realism. Like, the arguments for it are not compelling. And I think there's a couple other concerns, which is that, let me see if I could remember. So there's not a compelling case for moral realism. And I think he thinks an endorsement of moral realism is not sort of like entailed by Christian doctrine. Like, you're not compelled to be a realist if Christianity is true. And so it's also not necessary to be a Christian, to be a moral realist in order to be a Christian. So something like that.
Yeah, that sounds about right. From what I know, obviously I don't know Dave's like every single little opinion, but him and I actually did a debate on not on anything philosophical, but we did a debate about who wrote the Gospels. And it was hosted on my other friend, Kyle Whittington. He's a Catholic apologist. It was over on his YouTube channel. But regardless, Dave is a particularly, I'm trying to say this really nicely without like insulting the rest of apologetic YouTube. I find that Dave is completely happy and willing to hold positions that the rest of kind of Christian apologetics YouTube will not hold. And that's unusual. And that makes him like a really fun person to talk to. But by and large, the rest of Christian apologetic YouTube is kind of the way that you were just describing, where they will purposefully try to come up with these crazy scenarios about the aliens who show up wearing hats, or they'll, you know, try really, really hard to talk about like, you know, let P be this and Q be this. And then I'm going to throw a random sigma in there for some reason. And I'm, you know, throw epsilon in there too, because why not? And it almost feels like it's like they discovered philosophy for the first time, and now they're just like trying to like incorporate it into their apologetics. And it's entirely for the purpose of like, hey, look how smart Christian apologetics looks, instead of just having a conversation about the topics. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes off to me as performative and kind of trying too hard. And that to me, I think people can smell the inauthenticity in that, and it's not appealing.
Not everyone can smell it. And what I mean by that is I think that a lot of kind of just normal people who go to church on Sunday and don't really care too much about philosophy will hear this stuff and be like, oh, wow, like that sounds impressive. And then they kind of don't think about it again. And so I think that people who stop and think about it can smell it, but I don't think that everyone stops to think about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I'm drawing attention to what I take to be serious and fundamental problems in the methods of analytic philosophers. There are going to be people that are like, philosophy is bullshit. But, you know, what I was saying before is like, I don't think those people are often sufficiently well informed to be in a good position to make those judgments. So they're full of bullshit too. It takes a lot of work to know philosophy well enough to say, here's where the bullshit is. And what I'm finding is that look, I think I'm correct about at least some of the things that I'm calling attention to among analytic philosophers, and they don't like it. And one of the things they do that's strange, and maybe Christian apologists do, because it would be interesting to get your perspective on how Christian apologists operate, is, I'll express philosophical views that have been around over the past century or so, or have, resonance, like they're similar in some way to Wittgenstein, Hare, Bernard Williams. And then I'll have philosophers say stuff, not like professional philosophers say, yeah, no one thinks that way. This is a really fringe view. This is really an uncommon view. No one thinks this way. And like, what is okay, so it's not common, therefore it's wrong. Like what is the implication there? Like they really seem to be trying to dismiss the view. I think to try to be a bit more charitable to it, I think the idea is not just it is uncommon or rare, therefore it's wrong. I think it's more like this view is rare because the field has made sufficient progress that we've come to recognize and develop the arguments and appreciation and knowledge to know why it's wrong. And so, like, for instance, if I went around saying I'm a logical positivist, a lot of philosophers are going to say, yeah, there's a reason. It's not just that logical positivism is rare. There's a reason it's rare. And it's rare because it ended up being wrong, and we've all learned that it's wrong. So I think they're alluding to something like that. I don't know if apologists do anything similar when people like bring up concerns about the authorship of the Gospels, and no one thinks that. The scholars don't think that.
So Catholics definitely do. And I can speak way more intelligently about like Catholic apologetics than I can about non-Catholic Christian apologetics. But Catholics are a little bit unique in as much as they have this organized body, the church, right? The Catholic Church, with like a clear hierarchy. And it kind of sets out a whole lot of stuff that you more or less have to believe if you're going to be a Catholic in good standing. And so there is a lot of what you just kind of gestured at going on in Catholic apologetics. But it's not even like, hey, look, a whole bunch of really smart PhD philosophers all agree, so we're just plain old not going to consider anything outside of what is considered orthodox. It is, no, the Catholic Church has spoken on this. The issue is settled. There is no more discussion to be had about this. Church said something, case closed. And this isn't just papal infallibility either. Like it runs deeper than that. So for those of you who don't know, there's this concept within Catholicism called the magisterium. And the magisterium, there's two types of magisteria. There's the extraordinary magisterium, which is the Pope. But then there's the ordinary magisterium, which is just the collective wisdom of all the bishops around the world. And so a lot of Catholics will gesture at something like, for instance, the authorship of the Gospels. And they'll say something like, the ordinary magisterium has held it for thousands of years that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Therefore, it is considered infallible. So it is settled, and we're not going to listen to anybody who doesn't have the same opinion as the ordinary magisterium of the Catholic Church. And I think that what you were gesturing at is kind of just the secular version of what the Catholics do too.
Yeah, there's philosophers have been doing this a lot lately ever since. Are you familiar with this like Phil Papers survey?
Yeah, I quote it like frequently. And sometimes I get in trouble for quoting it because people will be like, well, you're just doing the whole appeal to popularity thing. And I normally have to couch my answer with like, yes, you're right. This is just an appeal to popularity. I'm just trying to show you what is and is not popular. And then but I always admit hey, look, I'm not a moral realist, so I'm unpopular too. But like, I'll point to nominalism and like in particular, because Catholics really can't be nominalists is something that I kind of like stress on my channel. And I'll say like, hey, look, so Catholics kind of have to be moderate realists too. And it seems like moderate realism is even less popular than like Platonic realism. So I'll be like, look, you have to accept kind of fringe positions within philosophy to be a Catholic. And then they'll say like, well, you're just appealing to popularity. And I'm thinking, you're right, I am, because I also accept a fringe position on morality. But I think you should think about this stuff. Like, that's my whole point. Is like, you should think for yourself and then decide. And if you do come up with a fringe position, great. Tell me why you believe in that fringe position. And I hope it's better than just somebody else told me to believe this.
Yeah, it's something to be clear on, is that I don't take the fact that I hold like minority positions on philosophical issues to be irrelevant. If you hold a view that's less popular, there is some onus on you to provide an account of why you endorse an unpopular view. What I don't like is that sometimes there's an implied context in the discussions where I see these appeals occur, where someone will come along and say, for instance, I'm an anti-realist, or I reject this position or that position. And then a philosopher will say, oh, okay, so you want to go against what the experts think? You want to go against expert consensus? Huh? Really? You want to do that? It's almost like, it's not like, well, here's a small bit of evidence against your view. Do consider that. It's the implication is you're holding a fringe position. Shut up.
Yeah.
It's used as a bludgeon. And I think it's obvious it's used that way. And I don't understand why philosophers somehow forgot about pragmatic implication and about how there's a subtext to what you say. And so if the conversation is, hey, I don't really study philosophy, but this position seems really implausible, and here's a couple not very good reasons why, and yeah, so I think I'm right, and I'm confident about it. And someone goes, well, the majority disagree with you. And so you would need to have very compelling reasons to override what the majority thinks in order to be justified. I'm not sure that you do. Maybe what the majority thinks is dumb and based on bad reasons.
Yeah, and I think that is legitimate. But I think that a popular move among apologists is not even to think about it in the slightest. Not even to think oh, I think that the majority have bad reasons for thinking this. They literally particularly among kind of fundamentalist Catholics, like the trads that I come from, it's, well, the church has already spoken, and so I'm not going to dedicate any time to thinking about this in the slightest.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So somebody in the live chat said Catholic Bibles, like the North American Bible, the NAB, will actually admit that scholars don't accept the traditional story in the notes, and that is perfect. That is true. So it's actually really funny that there's this huge divide between Catholic scholars and Catholics, particularly the Catholics that you find on YouTube. The Catholics that you find on YouTube tend to be far more traditional minded, even if they're not traditionalists like I was. But I will often quote Catholic scholars like Father Raymond Brown, who was a scholar of the New Testament, who very much so agreed that, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then there's also this concept within Catholicism called the nihil obstat. That's a Latin phrase that just means nothing objectionable. And so if a book receives the nihil obstat, it means, hey, a bishop looked over this book and the bishop said, this is good. There's nothing objectionable contained within this book. Father Raymond Brown's magnum opus, An Introduction to the New Testament, has received the nihil obstat. So the Catholic Church is very much so okay with the idea. It's funny. The Catholic Church is very different than Catholics, if that makes sense, particularly Catholic YouTube.
Yeah, that actually raises a point relevant to one of my sort of I want to say talking points, but that sounds bad.
One of your favorite soapbox topics.
Sure. So one of the things people on my channel know that my big thing is saying, hey, a lot of philosophers assume most people are moral realists, and I argue that it's not true, that it's not the case that most people are moral realists. One argument you will see from people is someone will say, hey, well, most people are theists. Most people are religious and they believe in God. And theists are moral realists. And they might even point to something like Christianity and say, Christianity pretty much entails moral realism. And so right there, that's a big chunk of realists. And they'll go on to just basically say, look, if most people are theists, then most people are probably realists. Now, that might seem plausible at first glance. I think that there's quite a bit to say in response. But one point I'll make about that, which is relevant to what you said, is that, let's take Catholicism. Let's say it was the official stance, and maybe you have a view on this, since you know a whole lot about this, that it's the church's official stance that moral realism is true. It doesn't follow that Catholics believe moral realism is true, because they don't just automatically believe whatever the religious doctrine that can't just infer based on church doctrine what that person's beliefs must be.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Even though you kind of shouldn't be according to the tenets of Catholicism, but case in point, around 2/3 of around 2/3 of Catholics, or at least I should say people who identify as Catholic, would not affirm a Catholic doctrine called the real presence. So a big part of Catholicism is that, during Sunday Mass, during daily Mass, when the priest takes the Eucharist and he elevates it and he says some words in Latin, at that moment, the Eucharist is no longer just a piece of bread. Now it is literally the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. It's not symbolic. That piece of bread is no longer bread. It is now the body of Jesus. However, and this is why Catholics can't be nominalists, the accidents have not changed, but the substance does change. So the abstracta is different, even though the concreta is the same. That's like how the Catholic Church has defined it. So if you're a nominalist and you just say, no, sorry, a thing is what its accidents are, then transubstantiation is impossible. And so that's why Catholics can't be nominalists. Regardless, 2/3 of people who identify as Catholic don't believe that it's literally the body of Jesus. They think it's figuratively the body of Jesus, which is a heresy. Like, you're not allowed
I've
to believe
encountered
that.
this. So I've encountered this where I've told people this. I had a Catholic friend who told me this. Like, that's the doctrine, because I wasn't raised Catholic. I was raised a Methodist. I don't even know what the Methodist position is. Like, it was a bad Methodist, I guess. Do you know, or is it you just know the Catholic one?
Methodists think that it's a symbol. So,
Okay, so
but by and large,
that's what I thought.
yeah, by and large, Catholic Christians think that it's real, and non-Catholic Christians think that it's a symbol. There is a little bit of wiggle room in there. So, for instance, the Anglicans are non-Catholic Christians who think that it's more than just a symbol, but they don't believe in transubstantiation. They believe in consubstantiation. It's a whole big thing. We don't have to get into the details of it. But
this stuff is cool. Are there
I
any,
like
so
it.
other than Catholics, who else, like Orthodox? Do they believe in transubstantiation?
Yes, Orthodox do believe in transubstantiation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, this is cool, right? So I remember telling people about this because after my friend told me this, I was like, no, and then I had to look it up, and then it appeared to be true. I don't really understand it anywhere near the level of detail. So then I went around asking people this, and I mentioned this to a few Catholics, and they're like, "That's not the church doctrine." I'm like, "Oh, yes, it is." So, so this would be a question I would have. So 2/3 of them, are they just asked the question, like, do you believe that, like, at that moment that it becomes, or did? So here's what I'm.
This is very timely.
Yeah. Do they know that that's the church doctrine, but not believe it anyway, or are they literally not even aware that that's what the church teaches?
Okay. So you're going to get different answers depending on what poll you look at. And the reason I said that this is a super apt and timely question is because a new poll literally came out like last week that changes the 2/3 stat that I'm quoting. So the 2/3 thing that I'm quoting comes from Pew Research. And Pew Research, their question was worded like a little bit funny. And it also asked people who self-identify as Catholic. So all that it takes you to answer this question is, are you Catholic? Like, do you call yourself Catholic? If the answer is yes, even if you haven't been inside of a Catholic church in 10 years, you're good to answer this question. So the people who haven't been to a Catholic church in 10 years, but self-identify as Catholic, are more likely not to know Catholic doctrine than the people who go to church every Sunday, and probably during the week too. Because I grew up going to mass 6 days a week. But a new poll came out that says something like 70% of Catholics believe in the real presence. However, this poll was only polling people who claim to go to church at least weekly. So it is different based on the population. But per that Pew poll, which is like the more, I guess, established poll between the two, I don't think Catholics knew what. It's not that they knew that the church taught this and that they just disbelieved it anyway, like in disobedience of Holy Mother Church. They just straight up didn't know.
Yeah, either of those don't surprise me really. But yeah, it's just a general point to emphasize is that members of religions often don't even know what the religion teaches. I
And
didn't.
that's particularly true of Catholics, I think, because there's just so much like in the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church is very like bureaucratic. And so things are very well defined. Like you can go read these documents from the Council of Trent in the 16th century, where they lay out exactly what Catholics have to believe about transubstantiation. And like, hey, that was at an ecumenical council. So like you've got to believe it. Like it's part of the, intellectual tradition of Holy Mother Church. So that's it.
Yeah, but see, that's the thing with other other denominations, is that they might have a lot less doctrine to know, but it might also be so much less well-defined. It's not at all clear what even counts.
Yes, precisely. Yeah. And that's something funny that you come across within Christianity at large. Christians love to tell other Christians that they're not real Christians because they don't believe in X, Y, or Z. And like, it's kind of like, well, what even is a Christian anyway? Like, what is a Catholic is probably a lot easier to define than what is a Christian, because the Catholic Church is very bureaucratic and they have this like list of things that you kind of have to be. Christianity, though, is a lot more amorphous. Like, So how does one Christian tell somebody else that they're not a real Christian? It's like, what does it even mean
Are
to be?
Mormons Christians? How about Jehovah's Witnesses?
So Catholics would say that neither of them are Christian, but they would say it with more oomph about Mormons. Why? Because Mormons think that there's a lot more gods than just like the Christian God. Like they think that everyone's going to be God. Like when you die, you become God of your own planet. Like God is just God of our planet. But when we die, if we're good, we'll become gods of other planets. So that like is too far out there for Catholics. Also, Jehovah's Witnesses think that like Jesus and Saint Michael were the same person or something weird like that. And if that implies that Jesus was an angel, not actually a man, then like, nope, Catholics would say part of being Christian is the belief that Jesus was both God and man. And so if you don't think that Jesus was both God and man, you're not a Christian. But who are we to tell them that they're not Christian? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's what the Catholics say.
Yeah, I don't. These arguments are. It's not my fight, but I find it a little strange. A lot of it seems to me to be morally loaded. Like it's just a way of saying I don't like you or I don't like your beliefs.
Yeah, 100%. It's speaking of morally loading these things, the Catholic Church is really good at that, especially if you read documents from before the First Vatican Council and before. That was in the early 1900s. So like, if you go back 100 years ago and beyond, the Catholic Church loved anathematizing people. So even popes, and they would write these really dramatic documents, and like they would list a name and then anathema, and then they would list another name, anathema. So Pope Honorius, anathema. And that means that they have anathematized Pope Honorius. And anathema, like when you anathematize somebody, you're pretty much saying like, hey, you're such a bad heretic that you're outside the Catholic Church. You're definitely not in heaven. You're probably in hell and you suck. And we're not going to listen to you. And it's very morally loaded.
Okay.
Yeah. And so back when the Orthodox Catholic split happened 1,000 years ago, each side was anathematizing each other. And yeah, so the church used to love that. They don't do that anymore because the church is a lot more like liberal and hippie today than it was 100 years ago. But there's a lot of that kind of moral kind of posturing within the Catholic Church, or at least there used to be. And here's something interesting for like, I think that you would have some cool insights on. And I've got a question for you. So I have reviewed Catholic, like the Catechism of the Catholic Church, for instance, to see if Catholics have to be moral realists. Like I've done this, and I couldn't ever actually define, or I couldn't find anywhere where the church actually defined morality. The church doesn't seem to actually speak about morality at all, but the church does talk a lot about sin. What is a sin and what's not a sin? Where do you see the concept of like morality and sin like meeting? Like, would you think that somebody who believes in the concept of sin is like necessarily a moral realist? Or can you imagine somebody being a moral anti-realist, but then have this conception of sin that almost replaces morality? Like, what do you think about all that?
I don't really have enough knowledge of like philosophy of religion or the doctrinal conceptions of sin that would be characteristic of different denominations. So I couldn't speak from any actual knowledge of sin, like from a technical perspective. But I don't see any reason in principle. Like this would be a better question for David Pullman.
Yeah.
But you're just asking someone that doesn't know about what sin is. It doesn't look to me, given my almost total ignorance on the topic, why you couldn't be an anti-realist about sin. And part of the reason I say that is just because anti-realism is simply a rejection of distinctive metaphysical and in some cases semantic characteristics of moral claims and like moral propositions and moral utterances that is so distinctive of and about particular types of disputes characteristic of analytic philosophy that it's like rejecting a position. It's like rejecting a technical position.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like I've never seen any indication from asking Christians. And this isn't to say that there isn't some, you can't necessarily just interpretation that has to go. So maybe someone could show this to me, but when I've asked, is it at all clear from just the Bible itself whether the Bible characterizes moral realism, or sorry, morality as being realist in nature? I've had people give me quotes, but none of the quotes come even close to indicating realism. They usually are stuff, they usually just normative claims or claims about God's divine authority or something like that. They all look to me like they're either totally irrelevant to the question of realism, or at best, it's an interpretive stretch. You have to kind of squint and strain quite a bit to see, but like I could see how you could get realism out of it, but it's not at all obvious to me. Now, but again, I'm not a Bible scholar, so I'm not going to tell people, if you tell me this says it's realism, you're wrong. But all I could say is, doesn't look like that to me. So I guess what my point is here is just that whoever like early writings, early thought on the notion of sin, I very much doubt it was intended to, or is structured in such a way so as to even touch on the kinds of disputes that academic philosophers are having in like the 20th century. That just seems strange.
I agree entirely. And I do think that the types of folks who are trying to kind of marry the two, like they're trying to marry these, ancient texts with the discussions of analytic philosophers in the 21st century. I think that those people are trying to use things like divine command theory to marry the two, where they're saying things like, well, morality simply is that which God desires. And so then we can look at these ancient texts, kind of deduce what God desires, and then, there we go. There's kind of the bridge between the two. I just don't know if there's fantastic support for the idea that like divine command theory is true.
It's also not even clear whether it's a realist or anti-realist position. I mean, it doesn't play nicely with the standard metaethical distinctions, because someone that's a proponent of divine command theory might point out, look, if you're categorizing us as an anti-realist because you're saying that the moral facts are dependent on God's stances, it seems really weird, because God's stances, given our views, are not contingent in the way that a human's stances are. Like, our big beef with relativism, like cultural relativism, subjectivism, is like, if I get conked on the head really hard, I could wake up tomorrow and think murder's okay. And then, like, from my point of view, it would be okay if I'm a relativist. And so your moral standards are sort of like always up in the air on the relativist position. And that's true. They would be. But the God's not like that. And so there is this very important conceptual difference. And I just want to say, you're right. I grant that. That is a very big, important conceptual difference. But that's not what that's not how we're distinguishing realism from anti-realism. It's not, are your stances contingent or necessary? It's, are they stances? Is it made true by a stance? If yes, it's not form of realism, period. It doesn't matter how magical, special, divine, supernatural, powerful, awesome, stemming from omniscience. It doesn't matter if it has all those properties.
God's stance is still a stance, right?
Yeah, it still stands.
Yeah.
So I do see Christian apologists sometimes, when the realism, anti-realism comes up, they'll want to make this move to say, well, sure, not contingent on not relative to human stances. And it's like, whoa, no, this isn't about, it's about any stances, not just humans. And then I've seen them give pushback. No, it's just about humans. It's, you run through the standard. I run through the standard line. Okay, so if an alien has a moral stance, then it's objectively true, because it's not a human. Like, how about a hobbit? Like, if Frodo tells me something is wrong, then it's objectively wrong because he's not a human. He's a hobbit. Like, that's ridiculous. So clearly, it's not like, and it's, of course, they don't really mean, I think, to be charitable even. It's not like biologically it has to be a human. So like elves can have objective. No, it's like, it's not like a contingent mortal being. God is different. But it's like, okay, that's not, secular philosophers drawing these distinctions, that's not what they're concerned with. So yeah, this is something that I wish could be more readily conveyed to Christian apologists, which is that the analytic philosophy is its own thing. And while, of course, there's a shared history, it's not so clear to me how much overlap there is.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And I think that the non-overlap between the two isn't very apparent to some of these people who are engaged in apologetics. I think that some people engaged in the apologetic project kind of just act as if all philosophy is philosophy of religion, when that's just like, it's just not the case when you actually look at it, you know?
Philosophy of religion, my guess, this isn't from personal knowledge, might be, my guess would be that it's one of the more insular sub-disciplines within philosophy. What I mean, you specialize in ethics, you probably get a touch of metaphysics and epistemology, and the same for those areas. But if you do philosophy of religion, I feel like the philosophers of religion, my guess is that they would hang out more with each other and a lot less with other people relative to how much those people hang out with each other.
I've seen that reflected in some statistics about like the percent, like if you go even if you go to the 2020 Pew survey and you filter by, like you can filter that survey by specialty. And one of the filters is philosophy of religion. And it's really funny if you look at something like nominalism versus realism, PhDs in philosophy of religion are actually considerably more likely to be realists than the baseline, which is just a combination of everybody. And I think that's because a lot of philosophers of religion are religious, like way more than your average PhD philosopher across any study. And I think that that does kind of speak to the insularity that you were getting at there. So I think that's a very,
Yeah, it seems plausible to me that, but I don't have data on this, so I'm not really sure. But I want to bring this back to metaethics, especially because I'm probably going to go in about 20 minutes, 20, 30 minutes. So I'm not going to stick around too long. I don't want a million-year stream. I think when they're like 3 or 4 hours, no one wants to even start them. Because they look at that and they're like, yeah, screw that. I'm not doing that.
I've got 2 hours. I don't have 4. Sorry.
2, maybe 4, hell no.
Yeah.
And 3 is pushing it. So what was I don't know exactly what to ask about. So, but I am interested because I know that didn't you do a discussion on metaethics before?
Yeah, so I did like a little bit of a debate with another David, so not Dave Paulman, but there's a Catholic podcast called Catholic Versus, and the host David has on people of all stripes, Catholics and non-Catholics, but the idea is kind of like Catholic versus Protestant, Catholic versus atheist, Catholic versus agnostic, whatever. And him and I did like a very informal debate. And I kind of structured like the topic of the debate was and I'm gonna mess up the actual like topic, but it was something to the effect of like it is totally rational to reject Catholicism on philosophical grounds. And so I posited 3 different philosophical positions that I think are like totally rational for people to take that are incompatible with Catholicism. And it seemed like it was received fairly well by the people who watched it. I I feel like nobody's really talking about like the philosophical implications of being Catholic, um, because I think that the Catholics who are aware of this just don't really want to talk about it. And I think that the non-Catholics just aren't interested. And I'm this weird nerd who's not Catholic or not practicing anyway, but who's actually interested in like what Catholics ought to believe if they really are calling themselves Catholic. And so, yeah, that was one conversation that we had, and it focused on nominalism, it focused on moral anti-realism, and then also mereology. So, yeah.
So is that something, are you up for talking about that a bit? Like where you
Absolutely.
stand on the meta? Great. Okay. So just tell us about your metaethical views.
So kind of just like, I guess, so I'm a moral anti-realist. I haven't thought a ton about like human flourishing and stuff like that. But I suppose that I like the idea of human flourishing. Um, and most of my kind of like ethics conversations are about virtue ethics, because Catholics by and large seem to be like virtue ethicists. So there's a lot of talk about like, cultivating virtues and stuff like that, which is fine, I guess. But did you want me to go anywhere in particular with this?
No,
Beyond,
open-ended, just go wild.
yeah, beyond me. So, obviously I grew up being like, a moral realist who never really thought about it, but like, 10 years ago, if you asked me, like, is it objectively wrong to, you know, torture a baby for fun? I'd be, yes, it is objectively wrong. Like, more like, it is, even though upon further reflection, like the church, I don't think actually defines it that way, but I don't think that I delineated the difference between sin and morality. Um, Even though there, like, clearly there is a delineation because, like you said, the people who are actually publishing on metaethics don't have really like they don't have a concept of sin. They have this concept of morality. Um, and so I think as I was kind of like exploring my religion and stuff like that, I realized that they're not the same. Um, and eventually, I just kind of, truthfully, it was when I started watching like your work like a year ago that I think I started getting more into anti-realism.
Awesome. I don't even think I knew that unless you told me and I forgot.
I don't know if I ever told you that actually. This might be the first time. But yeah. So I probably would have said something to the effect of like um I probably this is embarrassing, but I'm going to admit it anyway. I probably would have pulled like the whole like, the kind of Sam Harris move of like no, it is objectively wrong, but it is objectively wrong because what makes a thing wrong is that it's just opposed to human flourishing. You know what I mean? Like I would have done the whole
Mhm.
moral landscape kind of thing because I read that book when I was, 20 or whatever, and like it stuck with me for like a long time. So that's probably how I would have described myself until about a year ago, probably.
Cool. And so my videos influenced you?
Yeah. Your videos and also no, I think mostly like your live streams from like, when did you start your channel? Because I remember
I
this
think it
like a
was in
year.
January. So I think it was 2023, like the beginning of the year.
Okay, so maybe not a year then, maybe 10 months or whatever.
Yeah, well, we could actually look. This is what the internet is for. Let's see
There
when
you
my
go.
first video was. My first video was actually on free will, which is
Oh.
unusual because I don't think I've done another video on free will since then. I'm going back and checking now. And how many videos am I at now? I'm at 43 videos. Yeah, free will after show. It says 8 months ago. I'm looking up the exact day. I wonder if it went into February. Nope, January 7th. Yeah, so right at the start of the year.
Okay. So here's what I did. I just went onto YouTube and I just looked up moral anti-realism, and there are a couple of videos that have come up that I've watched that I remember watching that were formative. The first one that comes up for me is your video from 8 months ago called "Defending Moral Anti-Realism Against Three Common Objections." So that was definitely one of the formative videos for me. That's the one where you have pineapple and pizza on the thumbnail.
Yep. Yeah, I
Um,
see it.
and then also Kane B did a video like 2 years ago. Moral anti-realism defended a response to inspiring philosophy. Um,
Yeah. Mhm.
that video I definitely watched, but I don't want to say that I watched it when it came out 2 years ago. I think I probably because I got on this weird meta ethics kick like a year ago. So I think I probably watched that around the same time that I watched your video defending moral anti-realism against three common objections. Um, and oh yeah, that's right. So Majesty of Reason had Dr. Humor on a year ago with Dr. Loeb, and they had their discussion about moral anti-realism. So it was all that period of time. So from roughly a year ago, it looks like.
Yeah, early in the year, there was like a flurry of meta ethics stuff all over the place.
Yeah, and truthfully, I wouldn't have called myself an anti-realist until probably the big like January 2023, probably.
Cool. Well, I'm glad I had an influence on that. But yeah, I was going to say, Kane B should probably be in the mix here somewhere because Kane's been doing this stuff for like a decade now, putting out videos. And
Has he been
Kane
on
B has
YouTube
the
for a
best meta
decade?
ethics content on YouTube, I think.
Wow. Kane B definitely was part of my um, you know, moral anti-realism journey. Um, but truthfully, by just total hours watched, you probably top the chart in terms of like moral anti-realists who impacted my thinking. And I guarantee you that I'm not alone in that. I think that you really led the charge in terms of like popularizing moral anti-realism on YouTube. Like in our little niche of kind of like YouTube philosophy for the people, you know. I feel like before a year ago, it was very unpopular to admit that you were a moral anti-realist. And I feel like you're kind of unabashed, like, no, it's not weird to be a moral anti-realist. And we're really not even biting any bullets. That kind of approach, I think, has done a lot to kind of help people admit that they were moral anti-realists, maybe, or even like me. Like for me, it wasn't a problem of admitting it. I think for me, it was just a problem of, I don't think I really, like, it was almost beyond the pale for me, because I was like, I wanted to hold on to moral realism because I think I thought that the consequences were worse than they really were. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think it's very clear from my approach to this that I don't think moral anti-realism is unpopular because the arguments against it are good or the arguments for it are bad or whatever. Although I'm not a big fan of arguments in either direction. I think and this includes professional philosophers as well as lay people. I think its lack of appeal stems largely from smearing it and mischaracterizing it and applying anti-realist entanglement thing. For me, I think is a very big deal. Like, like someone will go, "Oh, so you don't think it's wrong to torture babies for fun?" And it's like, no, I do think it's wrong. I just don't think that it's magically wrong in the way that I think you think things are wrong. Oh, so you don't think it's wrong? Nope, I just said the opposite of that. And so there's this sort of pressure to try. And I use the baby torture example, which is bad enough, but that is not the typical example. I won't even mention the examples people use, but because I don't like to bring up. But people will just bring up the most horrific and awful shit in the world, and then try to say, if you're an anti-realist, you're okay with that stuff, and you can't object to people. And I mean, it's guilt. It's like this like attempt to make it look like an anti-realist is some sort of evil, psychopathic monster. And I don't understand why even professional philosophers do that. It's so weird. So yeah, when I started, what's weird about it is when I started pushing back against this, I started to realize that philosophers don't just do this for realism. They do this for all kinds of topics. And there's this, and this is part of what's behind the ostensible topic for today, this excessive formalism, is that philosophers will use formal arguments as cover for, in many cases, just foot stomping appeals to their personal intuitions. So a recent one that I wrote about, I'll just share it to see it. So do you know much about the consciousness stuff and like illusionism?
Much is probably putting it too strongly, but I'm like, familiar with the basics.
Okay, I'm going to give you an argument that and see how you react to it. I don't know if you saw this argument before, but here it is. In fact, I'll post it in the chat for people too. It's let me see if I can just post the whole thing. Yeah, cool. Here it is. Premise 1, people sometimes feel pain. Premise 2, if illusionism is true, no one feels pain. Conclusion, illusionism is false.
So I don't know if I accept premise 2.
There's going to be a problem with either premise 1 or premise 2. Yeah. So my concern with this argument is as follows. Here's the problem. When you say premise 1, people sometimes feel pain, that sounds totally innocuous. Like, of course, that's true that people sometimes feel pain. Then you get to the second premise where you have a concern with it. If illusionism is true, no one feels pain. Why do you have a concern with that?
Because I don't think that the illusionists are denying that people feel pain. I think that what people are talking about with illusionism is something like what pain is like, chemical reactions in brains, and chemical reactions in brains definitely do happen. Therefore, if we kind of take this like eliminative approach to what pain is, then like, yeah, people absolutely feel pain, even under illusionism.
Right. So here's the concern. In order for this argument to not equivocate, by feeling pain, it has to mean the same thing in premise 1 and premise 2. Otherwise, there's an equivocation. So
yes.
Here's going to be the problem. If by feel pain, you have a conception of pain that's consistent with illusionism, then the illusionist is just going to say, it's not the case that if illusionism is true, no one feels pain. And so then they'll accept premise 1, but reject premise 2. So in other words, let's say a functionalist conception of pain. People sometimes exhibit pain reactions. Okay, so if you replace feels pain with exhibit pain reactions, you have premise 1, people sometimes exhibit pain reactions. No problem. Premise 2, if illusionism is true, no one exhibits pain reactions. Obviously false. That's silly. Now, if you need that first premise to be true, you need a type of feeling pain that's inconsistent with illusionism, which means you need one where it's a phenomenal sense of pain, pain qualia. And so you might as well, at that point, that's the only way premise 1 is going to be true. You'd have to change premise 1, or to clarify premise 1 would mean something like people sometimes feel phenomenal pain, or people sometimes feel pain qualia. And so then you have premise 1, people sometimes feel pain qualia. Premise 2, if illusionism is true, no one feels pain qualia. Totally fine. But now the illusionist is just going to deny premise 1. They're going to say, well, my whole position is that there's no qualia. So your first premise is there are qualia? What the hell is that? I mean, look, imagine if I'm an atheist, and then you have your argument is premise 1, God exists. Premise 2, and you're
wait a minute.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
So the argument has a built-in ambiguity. It's either or. It's either there's a problem with premise 1 or there's a problem with premise 2, contingent on what the fuck feels pain means. So what my problem with this argument is that this is an obviously bullshit argument. It does not work.
I'm going to go over to my bookshelf and I'm going to grab a copy of Who Are You Really by Dr. Josh Rasmussen. And I'm going to explain exactly what you said, but instead of about pain, it's about the concept of self. And like, that's my one thing about this book. And I really like Dr. Josh Rasmussen a lot. I think he's like a really cool guy. And he even, let me grab the book. I'll be right back.
Oh, right. Antonio says it's basically a Morian shift at that point, which is just not an interesting argument to discuss. Yeah, it is a Morian
There
argument.
It is.
If you look at the paper. Great. Okay. I was just responding to someone in the chat.
Oh, okay. So in Who Are You Really? Dr. Josh Rasmussen makes a whole bunch of points about how who you are is, and he doesn't exactly use this language, but I think it's more or less like you are a soul inside of a physical body. Like you are not your body. You are like, the mind within kind of. And dang it, I'm not seeing it in the like table of contents, but towards the beginning of the book, he essentially says like, I might be question begging. And then he goes through the whole book. And I kind of think that the book is a little bit question beggy. And he talks a lot about qualia and stuff like that. And that's what reminded me of this book. And look, you can see that I'm not even done with it, but it already went back on my shelf. So I'm a really bad philosophy student because I don't finish books. But I think that exactly what you just said about equivocating on like pain qualia versus like, pain reactions and stuff like that kind of goes on in pseudo religious conversations. Like, who are you really? I think the same thing happens.
Yeah. Do you have the passage, or are we just not?
I was hoping that I was going to look at the table of contents and then just remember. If I had a PDF copy of this book, I would Control F for like begging and see if I could find it. But I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it in like, for instance, less than 10 minutes of dead air.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Maybe it's something to flag, but yeah, this is a common problem that I see with attempts to formalize arguments, is that when your argument is somewhat complicated and it relies on clarification about what you mean, compressing it all into a short syllogism, there's a loss of clarity, and that introduces ambiguity. And when you do that, you create a kind of, I guess you could say, an ambiguity filter. And so if you had a couple paragraphs to lay out your view, it might be fairly clear, like you're saying, I'm not saying this, I am saying that. Let me clarify what I mean by this term. What I mean by pain is phenomenal pain, which involves qualia. Here's my definition of qualia. You get to do all that. But if you then give someone a syllogism at the end of all that clarification, what are people going to remember from your argument? The syllogism. And that's what they're going to spread all over the internet. And that's what they're going to talk to one another about. And that's what everyone's going to respond to. And so someone responding to this argument that I gave you, I didn't even say who gave the argument. I didn't say what paper the argument was in. I didn't say what they said about the premises of the argument. You just have the syllogism. So people have to understand the sociology of the use of formal arguments, which is that formal arguments become a kind of lightning rod for people's attention, and they redirect us away from consideration of the nuance behind a person's actual position, and direct a whole bunch of attention towards something that is dumbed down, hypersimplified, ambiguous, and almost impossible to interpret in a useful way. And then it just, all of the debate centers on that. So I suspect, for instance, a lot of people misinterpret like the William Lane Craig version of the moral argument. They look at that first premise, like if God doesn't exist, then what? Objective morals and values and duties don't exist, something like that.
Right. Yeah.
I think a lot of people look at that and they interpret that might be prompting some people to go, oh, so they're saying if I don't think God exists, then I can't be moral. And that is not what that premise means. And Craig has to constantly clarify, I'm not saying you're a bad person if you don't believe in God. That is not what that is. Although that's possibly also just atheists being goofy too, having a negative reaction.
Speaking of Craig, though, I do think that a lot of this kind of like, syllogism, good kind of stuff kind of comes from Craig a little bit. Do you ever get, kind of like the whole like Kalam cosmological argument thing? Like that's like the one syllogism that like every Christian has memorized. You ever come across that?
Yeah, I've seen people throw like Craig versions of arguments at me quite a bit.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of the kind of like, syllogism chest thumping is kind of a result of like popular level books written by William Lane Craig. And then also like, so I just did a 3-part video on my channel reviewing a book by Catholic apologist Trent Horn called Answering Atheism. And Trent Horn presents like 7 different arguments for the existence of God in it, and each chapter begins with a syllogism. But one of the arguments is the Kalam, and he just literally just says, I'm just stealing this straight from William Lane Craig. It's like 1970 whatever paper. But the other syllogisms that he presents, he probably formulated them himself, but they are very William Lane Craig in their like presentation, and so I do think that a lot of this kind of like syllogism chest thumping stuff kind of originated from William Lane Craig.
That's plausible. I wouldn't know the history. We did get a little off topic, and I do want to close things out in maybe about, 10, 15. I don't know if you got more time, then that's cool. Maybe I'll drag it out a bit. But so you started talking about what caused you to become a moral anti-realist. But then now I'm more just curious for you to develop on that and say a bit more about what your current perspective in metaethics actually is.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess my current perspective is probably somewhat similar to yours, in as much as like, I don't care a whole lot what PhD philosophers might say is like moral or immoral, as much as I care about things like so not not to get to the moral landscape on everybody, but like I do care about other people, and so I want to do things that are going to help the most other people. And so that's kind of just how, but and I don't feel like I need to ground that in anything deeper than that's just what I want to do. And if you don't want to do that, then great. I don't really want to hang around you. And that's really it. Like I used to have these kind of aspirations of being able to ground my kind of, moral reasoning in God, or, in Thomas Aquinas, something like that. But really, and honestly, like now I don't. And when I actually just had somebody reach out to me the other day asking to debate me on, at first he said abortion. And I said, like, I really just don't feel like debating abortion, if that's all right. But he said, how about the morality of marriage? And he was clearly, because I was on a video that I did about like the Catholic stance on gay marriage. And I said, like, I would be very happy to debate gay marriage with you, but I should let you know that I'm a moral anti-realist. So we might run into problems right away if you're trying to debate that it's immoral to get gay married. And I'm like, what does that even mean? And he's like, well, whatever the church is against is immoral. The church is against gay marriage. Therefore, the gay marriage is immoral. And I'm like, well, if we're just couching our terms that way, I probably won't disagree with you. If the church is against gay marriage, and the church is against gay marriage, the church is against gay marriage, therefore the church is against gay marriage. Like, yeah, you got me. But I'm not super interested in what the church is against and what they're not against. I'd be interested in knowing their reasons. And the church does ground their morality in teleology. And so if I've made any progress anywhere, it's just that I used to think that morality was like teleological in nature, and I no longer think that's the case.
Fair enough.
And I can talk a little bit about like what I used to think about like the teleological nature of morality, if you think that'll
Sure.
be
We haven't
interesting.
talked about that much on this channel, so I'd
Okay.
be really interested in hearing about that.
So the Catholic Church teaches that things are wrong if they frustrate their teloi. Teloi is a Greek plural of the Greek singular telos. Telos is the Greek word for end or purpose. Everything has a telos. So if you go read the ancient Greeks like Aristotle, they will talk about how an acorn has the telos to grow into an oak tree, or whatever like that. It's funny, if you keep reading Aristotle, he'll say that mud has the telos to bring forth eels, because he thought that eels came forth from the mud. Like, anyway, but Catholics will go on to say things like, it is immoral to have any kind, like to engage in any kind of reproductory acts that don't wind up, that are not oriented towards procreation. So what does that mean? It doesn't just mean that gay marriage is off the table. It also means that heterosexual couples can't engage in any kind of activity that isn't open to life. So any kind of contraception is immoral according to the Catholic Church. This is something that not a lot of Catholics know, but it's very clearly defined in church teaching. And so, for instance, and not to be too crass or anything, but the use of condoms is going to be immoral according to the Catholic Church. And why? Why is the use of condoms immoral according to the Catholic Church? Why? Because condoms frustrate the telos of the sexual act. That's the church reasoning. And they'll go on to say things like, so for instance, it's actually also a sin to purge. Like if you have the eating disorder where you eat and then you throw up, like you're purging, that is also a sin, because you're frustrating the end of the act of eating. Like you're supposed to eat to, give your body nutrition. And if you purge afterwards, you're frustrating the telos of the act. So that's immoral. And why is murder immoral? Because the telos of your life is to give greater honor and glory to God. If you are ending somebody's life, you are stopping their ability to give honor and glory to God. So that's why it's immoral. So they'll couch everything in this kind of teleological lens. And for a long time, that was enough for me. That was all right. But then I started thinking about gay marriage. And frankly, it's when one of my close friends came out as gay. And I was like, wait a minute. In my heart, I don't actually think that this guy is sinning by being gay. Why don't I feel that way? So then I started investigating teleology, kind of just as a ground of morality. And I started thinking about something for instance, acrobats walking on their hands, right? The telos of the hands is not walking. It's grabbing things. So if you walk on your hands, is that immoral to do so? I didn't think it was. And it's funny, Thomas Aquinas actually writes about this, and he says something to the so in the Summa, he writes, it's not actually wrong for an acrobat to walk on their hands, because after the acrobat is done walking on their hands, they can still go use their they're not actually acting contrary to the hands teloi. They're just not in that moment. They're not fulfilling the teloi of what their hands are for.
If that's the rationale, why wouldn't I be able to say, couldn't I have sex with a condom because it's not stopping me from having sex without a condom later?
Bingo. Even theoretically, being gay doesn't prevent you from having heterosexual relations later on. If you really wanted to, you could. I don't think a lot of them want to. But there's nothing in like there's nothing that makes it impossible for a gay person to act in a heterosexual way. I mean, in fact, it happens a lot for people who are like closeted and stuff like that. And so for that reason, I was like, wait a minute. So if things are only wrong if we are permanently ceasing the ability, so like that might still leave like murder on the table. Like maybe murder is still wrong even under this like teleological lens.
Yeah.
But
What about torturing someone but keeping them like without
exactly,
killing them? Like, what
yes,
is that? Okay?
because you're not permanently removing. So like in the moment, you're not allowing them to fulfill their ends, right? Like they're not going about like you are stopping them from living a life that will glorify God in that moment by detaining them. But as long as it's not a permanent detaining of that person.
So the philosophy part of my brain, which I'm not even sure I want it there, but it starts coming up with really weird stuff. So here would be one. What if you could do some sort of like horrible brain surgery on people that would make them want to glorify God? So you just take a person like the person that's like trying to get people to fulfill their purpose, like the teleological villain, and they're like, I'm going to release a chemical that makes everybody super Catholic. Like, would that be okay? Because you're actually prompting them to fulfill their purpose.
A
Or would it?
Catholic might say something like this: part of the telos of being human is like freely choosing to like give honor and glory to God. And so you, by removing their free choice to give greater honor and glory to God, you would be sinning by like you'd be doing something immoral by frustrating everybody else's end, by frustrating their purposes, because
Is
part of
it
their
frustrating
purpose
their
is,
purpose?
if part of their purpose is to do to do what you're going to force them to do, but to do it freely, then perhaps you are frustrating their purpose. Now, I am very much so playing devil's advocate here, so I
Yeah, I
know,
just what if a person wants to like be a martyr and say, "Look, I know I'm doing wrong when I do this, but it's having it's having really good effects for everybody else." But also, so let's say you could do this to you could modify someone's germline so that all of their children come out having this, because now you're not actually changing anyone's free will. You're changing which children they end up having.
um so Catholics have this theory of so it's like this staunchly realist theory of like human nature. And so they might say something like this: it is part of human nature to like a properly functioning human is a human that has free will. So this is why they will say something like it is not a sin for somebody who's born infertile to engage in married heterosexual sex. So if you were born like a male and somebody else was born a female, and you two got married, you found out that you were infertile, like you cannot have children, you are still allowed to engage in relations with your wife per the Catholic Church, because even though it is impossible for you to actually get her pregnant, you are like your telos doesn't change just because the accidents aren't there. And so they might say that the person who is, creating this, like, the next generation of of humans who are going to be missing that part of free will would still be sinning, because that person would be frustrating the TLOI of the children who are going to be born, perhaps. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
I
I'm
think,
just so I get all that, and a lot of it sounds like kind of to me strained, ad hoc, and not very plausible, because
yeah,
it seems like they're picking their conclusions first and then seeing
yes,
how they could fit their views to the
one
views.
hundred percent.
But what I'm trying to do is come up with stuff that is consistent with the principles, but it would be like awful, or they wouldn't want to accept it. Like either it's something I think they wouldn't want to accept, or that people generally would find really morally awful, but that isn't inconsistent with the notion. And but I'm guessing like they'll just always come up with a way of rationalizing.
There's always like a just so story for like why everything that the church teaches is actually in line with like the TLOI and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's funny, you know, that they will come up with these like, you know, hey, why is it okay for a sterile heterosexual couple to have sex, but it's not okay for a gay couple to have sex? Like, why is the one okay and the other is not? Well, because it's part of what it is to be a, like, you know, the teloi of man is procreation, the teloi of woman is procreation. So you can engage in the procreative act, even if like, but you know what's funny is that it would still be immoral for that couple to use a condom because
What?
yeah, no, I'm serious. This is actual Catholic teaching. Like a sterile married heterosexual couple can illicitly engage in sex, and that's fine, even if they're infertile. But if that infertile couple uses a form of birth control, then they're sinning because you can't do anything to willfully frustrate the teloi of the act. But if you're not willfully sterile, which so that's why it's like getting a vasectomy would be immoral per the Catholic
Right.
Church. But if you were born without the ability to create sperm or something, that's not your fault, and so you're good to go.
So does the Catholic Church have a stance? This is going to sound weird, but I promise I have a point. Do they have a stance on the existence of extraterrestrial life?
Officially, no, but like Catholic apologists have spoken about it.
And do they tend to think that there is, or there isn't, or there could, or there couldn't be? What do they tend to think?
It depends on which apologist you talk to, but I do find that the more reasonable ones think that, yeah, it's like totally possible. And one of two things is the case. Either they are like it's alien life, but they're just non-rational. And Catholics define rational, meaning you like the soul that you have will live forever. So the Catholics don't think that animals are rational, meaning that when an animal dies, their soul dies with them. But when we die, our souls will live forever and they'll either go to heaven or hell. They might make a pit stop in purgatory first because that is a Catholic thing, but ultimately everybody's soul is going to wind up either in heaven or hell. Not so with animals. Their soul gets destroyed when they die. And so there might be aliens. Maybe those aliens are actually more intelligent than we are, but they're still not going to be rational. Like their souls will die with them. Humans are the only things in the universe that have immortal souls. Or maybe they do have immortal souls, but then that would mean that God definitely appeared to them too. Or maybe like they just never, like their Adam and Eve never sinned or something. So like they never needed to be saved in the first place or something like that. Like all of those
this could get, oh, sorry.
No, it's just like any one of those things are like viable options for Catholics, but it's not a viable option to have like a rational species of alien for which God never made himself manifest.
Yeah, I really wonder what they would do if we encountered extraterrestrial civilizations and then we talk to them. They're clearly like, let's say if they're very utopian and they're very generous and kind and compassionate and a wonderful civilization. And then we ask them like, yeah, so how was it when Jesus showed up there? And they're like, what are you talking about? There's no Jesus here.
So I actually, I went to a homeschool co-op in the basement of the church that my grandparents founded. And there was a priest who taught us science and religion. And one thing that he said to us is like, this is just my personal opinion, but like, I wouldn't be surprised if like aliens landed on Earth and like they pulled out their Bible and they're like, hey, we're here to spread Christianity to you guys. And we were like, oh, we're actually already Christians. And the aliens would be like, you guys know Jesus? We'd be like, yeah, we know Jesus. They'd be like, sweet. And then that would be it, like kumbaya. So that is a belief that some Catholics hold.
Okay, I mean it's consistent. That would also be pretty good evidence to me. So if beings from another galaxy showed up and they have like a Bible that's basically like we translate it, and we're like, this shit's a Bible. Like I would be like, huh, okay.
I'd convert. Yeah, I'd be Catholic.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd convert on the spot. I would have a few questions. Like, did you intercept our broadcasts and then you're pranking us? Because like, what if it's just that it's like a civilization of trolls and they just go around like just punking the shit out of different planets?
That'd be so funny.
Like we have the same history as you. Like they're just copying our history. Goes quick, copy it. Make up that stuff.
Did you guys have an ancient Roman Empire?
Yeah, and then we're just like, what? Like, you have a story. You have a Song of Ice and Fire too. We have this word for word in our language. We've had it for 4,000 years. Yes, it was written by Zorlob R.R. Martin. Like, So yeah, maybe they would do that. So there are some possibilities other than, yeah, Jesus is real, God exists, Christianity is true. There is the aliens are pranksters, or we're living in a really strange simulation. And I don't know, we like two different, like, I don't know, maybe there's resource constraints, and two different aliens in another universe are both running their projects of like what happens when you introduce Christianity. And like one group is like, we're going to give it to the humans. Look at these dumb things. Look at them. And then there's like another planet with like, I don't know, tentacle monsters. And they're like, we're going to give them Christianity and see what they do. And then like, they're like, oh shit, there's cross contamination. They're talking to each other. Because like they just put us in the same universe. Because like their lab supervisors, like, look, you only get to have one universe to run your studies in.
Yeah.
So like that's a possibility. I would want to check on that.
Yeah, and I mean, me too, of course. But I'm not going to lie to you. Like, obviously it's really difficult to know yourself. But I have a feeling if an alien species showed up and they literally had like our Bible, I would probably believe.
I don't know how I would react, but I wouldn't do that thing that some atheists frustratingly do, which is where they're like, it wouldn't matter if angels descended from the sky and Jesus showed up and uppercutted me into the moon and is like, I'm fucking Jesus. And then they're like, I'm hallucinating then. Come on. Look, right now, I'm not hallucinating. That's silly. I'm not hallucinating. If Jesus shows up and is like, yo, I'm real, Christianity's true, peace out, and then like flew away, already that's going to be a completely life-changing event for me.
Yeah.
I'm going to have a lot of questions. Like I might think, was I hallucinating? I really don't think so. I think Jesus showed up and flew away.
I frustrate a lot of my religious friends when they ask me, so like, what would it take you to like believe again? And I normally just say like, well, a Damascus Road experience would probably do it for me. And so for those who don't know, in the Bible, like, Paul of Tarsus is on the road to Damascus and he gets struck blind, flash of light, falls off his horse. He hears a voice from the heavens that says like, hey, like, it's me, Jesus. And like, you really better believe. And by the way, like walk to the city. It'll take you 3 days to get there. When you get there, you'll get your sight back. So sure enough, like Paul walks for 3 days. He gets to the city, he gets his sight back. That would do it for me. Like almost definitely. And I can't know myself perfectly, but like that would probably do it for me. Yeah. And I think that
it might be that though, that's if something psychologically changed in your brain, it could be that was the result of some strange brain anomaly that causes you to believe. So in that case, it's not a question of would I believe on some sort of epistemic grounds. It's like, if you're describing a scenario descriptively, hey, your brain changes, so now you believe in God. Okay, well then I guess I would.
Yeah. 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 That's a really simple way of putting it. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think I'm like like super unconvincible. So
I don't think so either. I think that I am skeptical. Like I think I have a skeptical disposition. Like I don't believe things the first time that I hear them. In general, like if it's outlandish, and sometimes my friends get mad at me when they like, they'll bring up, I don't know, pick your thing. They'll say something about, I've got friends who are into like, the rock crystals and stuff like that. And they know not to bring it up in front of me because I'll be like, are you sure that stuff's real? But, and like essential oils and stuff like that, like, all the, like the diet stuff, I'm always like, are you sure about that? But all that being said, I don't think I'm unconvincible. I'm skeptical, but I believe in a whole lot of things.
A whole lot of things?
Yeah, just, I have tons of beliefs. Right?
Yeah, it is funny. I don't see too much of this anymore from apologists or anyone else. Like, you're an atheist, so you don't believe in anything? And I'm like, well, I believe we're having a conversation right now. What do you mean? But this is I haven't brought this up on the channel before, I don't think, and I don't know if a lot of people know this about me. So I became an atheist around the time I was like 17 or so. Now, religion was never a super big thing for me, but at the same time as I started to become an atheist, prior to that, I used to be totally in on like all the paranormal nonsense. So cryptozoology, I thought Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster were real. I believed in the crystal magic stuff. I even have like a little crystal skull. So I was really into the crystal skulls. I don't know if you've heard this. There's all these crystal skulls all over the world that people will say, these crystal skulls are thousands of years old and they can curse people or heal people or do all this shit. And it's like some person made them like 100 years ago, and they made them in like a glass factory. Like there's nothing special about them. So I was in all that shit. I thought the moon was fake and it was full of aliens. I thought there was a big alien abduction conspiracy cover up. All this stuff. So like basically, if it was like X-Files shit, I thought it was real, like all of it. So what happened is I ran into someone and they told me that a psychic investigator was coming to my campus to to give a talk. And I thought they meant a person that uses psychic powers to investigate things. Isn't that what you would have thought? Like a psychic investigator?
Probably.
Okay. Do you know who it was? You might know who this person
Was
is.
it like James Randi or something?
It was James Randi.
Rest in peace. I love James Randi.
It was James Randi. James Randi lived in Davie, Florida. Lived like driving right near me. Like 20,
I did not know that.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So James Randi was the person. He's a person that investigates psychic. So I was wildly mistaken. So I went to this talk, and I didn't know who this. So the person shows up, and it's James Randi, and it's a magician that's going to. So if people don't know, James Randi was a magician that was big in the like paranormal and pseudoscience skeptic community. So did a lot of stuff busting fake faith healers. So people that would actually secretly gather information on people and then use that. Or some people do cold reading where they're able to just use tricky ways of asking questions to solicit information from people. Not going to get into that now. Homeopathy and a few other types of like fake medicine, fake astrology, that kind of thing. Anyway, so Randy shows up, gives this talk. It completely flipped my world upside down in like one day. So like one night, like 2 hours, I was just like, holy shit. So I remember going to the website, like randy.org or whatever it was. And I would read it like reluctantly, like, no, like it burns. Facts. And so it didn't take very long. And pretty soon I was like really big on like busting pseudoscience and getting into skepticism and all that stuff. But for me, that I did like a complete 180 in the span of maybe 2 years. And that was a very strange experience. And I don't think I've ever mentioned that on my channel. So I thank you for like, it's so part of the past now that I mean, we're going on 20 years now, or maybe we're past 20 years. Holy shit. Where that happened. It was like more than half of my life ago. It's hard to even remember that. But yeah, I used to be a big, like, the moon is fake. It's full of aliens. I thought the moon was was artificial and was designed by aliens, and it was hollow, and that they were living inside of it.
Wow.
So
you had some beliefs, man.
Yeah, you said you had a lot of beliefs. I had a lot of beliefs. They were. Oh, I was into the Bible code.
Oh,
I mean, the Bible code's ridiculous. It's so stupid.
Yeah.
So
was it like the KJV Bible code stuse like where it's
I don't remember. I got a couple books on the Bible code, and it was like someone getting secret messages out of it, and it's just like just complete horse shit. But yeah, it was just a total serendipity that I was like confused, and then James Randi happened to live nearby and give this talk. So yeah, that was pretty cool.
You unlocked a memory for me. I was into James Randi and stuff like that in like college. Like I love his work, and he just passed away like a year or 2 years ago or something. It wasn't that long ago.
It was a year or two ago. Yeah.
Yeah. But I remember watching a bunch of his like YouTube videos and stuff like that. Kind of at the time. Oh, you know what happened? It was I knew some people who were like into psychics and stuff like that. And as a good Catholic man, I knew that psychics were all BS. So I like was watching James Randi to try to debunk the psychic stuff. And it debunked my own religious faith too. Like, obviously that wasn't the only thing, but it was at the same, right? So I'm into James Randi at the same time that I'm starting to think that like, hey, maybe morality isn't based in teleology. And like a whole bunch of different things kind of all came together that caused me to kind of stop being Catholic. But Randy was definitely a part of that. I kind of forgot until you brought up Randy right now. So you unlocked that. You like unlocked a memory for me.
Yeah, that was it also that got me motivated because and the religion stuff seemed to be dropping out on its own automatically. So I remember I had this weird view. I went to this church. I didn't really go to like sermons and like church stuff. I went to like the Sunday school class. It was kind of like an informal Bible study kind of thing. And I had this view, was like, hey, maybe we should go read like what's in other religious texts and go read what atheists say, because it seems kind of win-win. You know, if we could read it, and then we'll either discover why exactly they're wrong, and woohoo, we could be double sure we're right, or maybe they're right. And wouldn't it be nice to know? Like, I would want to know if Christianity is not true. Um, I, fortunately, people weren't like, never do that. That's the way to Satan. They were not like that. They were like, you better be careful. We don't think that's a great idea. Uh, but no one was like, thou shalt not pass. And like they stood in front of me. So I went ahead and picked up a lot of books, and yeah, it was pretty quick. I was like, oh no, there's a problem here. I think I believe a bunch of bullshit. And yeah, again, it just didn't take very long. I don't know. It was like the moment I read shit that conflicted with Christianity, I was like, oh, okay, so it is wrong. It didn't take long. I just needed to actually do it. It's weird though, because most of the Christians I end up interacting with have read this stuff and they're totally unconvinced by it. So why was I so easy to flip? And I'm not saying it's because I was like, I can track the truth with my magical truth tracking prowess. I don't feel like I was ever really that much in the grip of Christianity in the first place.
That is probably a big part of it. I do think that a lot of people who kind of like are in the grip of Christianity will read that stuff kind of like knowing that like I already know that I disagree with this before I start this book, so I'm just going to open it up and try to find the things that I disagree with and then explain why I disagree with them. For some, for others, I've become cynical in my old age, but there are definitely Christians out there who sure, maybe they were born Christian, but they've done their homework and they're still convinced Christianity is true. There are definitely people like that out. I think Dave Pullman is a great example of somebody who has done his homework and is still convinced. And I don't think he's dishonest or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't tend to think people go around going like, I know it's wrong, but I'm going to pretend. This is bullshit. I think people believe what they believe. I don't know why I was so persuadable. Part of the reason I was persuadable, and maybe David Pullman isn't, is because I didn't read a bunch of shit. Like I was not very knowledgeable. So if I was, maybe like, look, if I had read a bunch of Christian stuff, maybe it would, and maybe that's because it's true. I really, 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 really don't think so. But of course it's a possibility. And that my views changed just because I was goofy and wrong. Again, I don't think so, but yeah, I lots of people are sincere in their beliefs. It's one of the most frustrating things. It's actually something I brought up on the channel. I brought it up so many times. I'm almost reluctant to bring it up because this happens to me quite regularly because of my views in philosophy. So I'm in the illusionist camp in philosophy. So I actually take a more extreme view called qualia quietism, where it's not just that I don't even think they're qualia. I don't even think the concept of qualia is meaningful. So very similar to my views on some forms of moral realism. And I routinely encounter people. I would maybe once or twice a month, so maybe it's not that common, where they'll just tell me I'm lying about my philosophical views. So I say I don't have so you don't think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? No, I'm an anti-realist. I think it's wrong, but I don't think it's wrong in the way that you think it's wrong. I think the way you think it's wrong is conceptually confused. And I have my own views about normativity, and I think it's wrong in a way that makes sense to me. To go through all that, but then if they say, but you don't even have the intuition, and then if I say no, and I don't recall ever having it, they'll tell me I don't believe you. You did at one point. What the hell? So they know what I was like 20 years ago better than I do?
Yeah.
What the hell is that? But yeah, you do encounter that where people will, including on occasion, people that have done quite a bit of studying in philosophy will just say, you did believe this, or you must think this. It's really weird. And if you disagree, you're lying.
When a religious person pulls that, like, you're lying if you say that you never had this intuition thing, part of that comes from, like, the Bible says that it's written on everyone's hearts. Like, morality is written on all of our hearts. So for the religious folks out there, okay, they may just be, informed by their religion. But when people who aren't religious pull that, I'm always like, how do you, where is this even coming from?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things I'd say about it. One is that I think for many people that study but it does become very, very important to their identity and their sense of value and meaning and purpose. It's their moneymaker as far as their beliefs go, is doing philosophy the standard way that they do philosophy. And so within academic philosophy, and people that read academic philosophy, even if they're not themselves academics, they'll be told over and over, this is intuitive, this is intuitive, this is, philosophers don't tend to say, I find this intuitive, or I think most people find this intuitive, or I think most people with professional training in contemporary analytic 21st century philosophy find this intuitive. They don't say all that. They'll just say it is intuitive.
Right.
Why speak that way? That's there. I thought, and I make this point a lot, philosophers are all about clarity and precision and rigor. So why are you saying like the hard problem of consciousness, or whatever, the response to the Mary's room situation is intuitive, as though it's a feature of the thought experiment and not a feature of your psychology? That's weird, because whether something is intuitive or not is a psychological question. So like, what are they talking about? And yet they talk this way. And I've made this complaint over and over. I'm not prominent enough for anyone to give a shit or listen to me, but hopefully someday, someone will say in a philosophy class, don't say it's intuitive, say I find it intuitive, or most people, like, be specific. But they won't do that. And it's this bad habit, and it gets drilled into them from the moment they're undergrads. So, undergrad, that's 4 years. Grad school, who knows? People take 7, 8 years. They take a long time sometimes. So this over a decade of being inundated with reading and writing and discussions, and philosophers are big on language. And so they have been steeping in 10 or 15 years of people saying this is intuitive, that's intuitive. And so when you come along saying, for instance, I don't find, the repugnant conclusion counterintuitive, they don't know what to do with that, because it's counterintuitive. So if you say, oh, I don't think it's counterintuitive, well, then you're not thinking correctly. It is counterintuitive. But this is coming from someone that studies experimental philosophy. You go give these questions, these stupid questions that they're like, it's intuitive, and you give it to like people. You're not going to get 100% of people. You're going to get some, and you're not even typically getting like 96%. You get 80-20, 70-30. You're always getting people that are like, that's not intuitive. Yeah, it is. What the hell is with the philosophical resistance to this? So this is coming from them just being saturated in that way of thinking. And what I don't understand is the hyper confident, derisive hostility. Where the hell is that coming from? It's totally unearned. It's not like they did a study and they found 99% of people think this way. So if I'm denying it, I'm probably lying. Also, what is my motive for lying in most of these cases? It's really weird.
I know that point, and then your point about what like the common folk think are probably like two of my favorite points that you make on your channel, like consistently. Do you know what I'm talking about? I've heard you say it multiple times. You'll say like a lot of like, the kind of the philosophical literature will talk about like, what most people believe. And it's like, have you spoken to most people? Like most people don't behave in the way that some people think that they behave. You know what I mean? Do you know what point I'm talking about?
Oh yeah. So philosophers do really. So, but I also, when I press this point against them, so I'll say stuff like, look, we don't really have good empirical evidence that most people are moral realists. In fact, the best designed study that has explored this question is a paper by Pulsar and Wright, and they found 3/4 of the participants gave anti-realist responses. Now,
really?
do I think? Oh yeah, that's 2020 anti-realist pluralism.
I'm Googling that right now so that I can like look into it more later.
I could pull it up right now, and let's do it. And so I could say a few things about that paper. I do have a critical response to that paper in my dissertation. So it's called Anti-Realist Pluralism. I covered up the title. Give me 1 second. Anti-Realist Pluralism, a New Approach to Metaethics, Thomas Pulsar, Jennifer Cole Wright, 2020. And I'll just read the abstract. Many metaethicists agree that as ordinary people experience morality as a realm of objective truths, we have prima facie reason to believe that there actually is such a realm. Recently, worries have been raised about the validity of the extant psychological research on this argument's empirical hypothesis. Our aim is to advance this research, taking these worries into account. First, we propose a new experimental design for measuring folk intuitions about moral objectivity that may serve as an inspiration for future studies. Then we report and discuss the results of a survey that was based on this design. In our study, most of our participants denied the existence of objective truths about most or all moral issues. Wow. In particular, many of them had the intuition that whether moral sentences are true depends both on their own moral beliefs and on the dominant moral beliefs within their culture. This finding suggests that the realist presumptive argument may have to be rejected, and that instead anti-realism may have a presumption in its favor.
I've literally never heard of this before. And this paper is 3 years old. How has nobody talked about this besides you?
I don't know. People are not talking about this. So what I can say about this is you might say, Lance is cherry picking. He's just picking a study where most people gave anti-realist responses. I am not cherry picking. So first of all, I do cover and discuss the other papers. Now, what I should say about this is that Wright and Pulsler have been at the forefront of identifying, cataloging, responding to, and attempting to correct for methodological problems with the earlier studies in metaethics. So that, like the psychology of metaethics. There are quite substantial methodological problems. I list a whole shit ton of them in my dissertation, but Pulsler and Wright have both described and responded to and dealt with some of them themselves. Pulsler was one of the first to write a comprehensive paper analyzing those methodological problems. So to give this context, this paper is 2020. This work goes back to about 2003 with a paper by Nichols and Folds Bennett. No one's really replicated that to my knowledge. But the paper that really got the ball rolling introduced the disagreement paradigm, and that's 2008, Goodwin and Darley. And so this goes back to about 2000. It goes back earlier, but that's the paper that really got the ball rolling. Anyway, there are significant methodological problems with that Goodwin and Darley study. And what they do is they identify and describe those methodological problems. And then they say, we are doing a redesign where we're going to introduce a whole bunch of different paradigms. So in other words, different ways of measuring. It's almost like if you're saying, look, we don't trust this person's thermometer. We don't think it's good at getting the temperature. So we designed 7 different thermometers that all rely on different mechanisms for telling the temperature, and they all give us the same result. So it's like internally corroborating paradigms. And what we did is we identified all the problems with the previous thermometer, and we fixed as many of them as we possibly could. We can't fix all of them, but we did our best. And so we have our 7 new thermometers that are specifically designed to fix the problems with the previous thermometers. And we get people are mostly anti-realists. Now, does that mean people are mostly anti-realists? No. This is one study. You would want to see it replicated. 2, the majority of the participants were drawn from college students in the United States. College students are disproportionately likely to give anti-realist responses. That's not very surprising. And then also people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk. It's an online survey platform. People from the United States on Amazon's Mechanical Turk are much more likely than the general population to be non-religious, atheist, or agnostic. And so those populations are also disproportionately likely to give anti-realist responses. So one serious problem with this study is that the sample populations are not representative of the general US population, the world population. So we don't know from this study if most people are anti-realists. What we know is that most people in that sample gave anti-realist responses. Now, I'm very skeptical of the conclusion, but the bottom line is this is the best designed study we've got. I should also tell you, we have another quite well-designed study from Taylor Davis. It's not quite as comprehensive with all the different paradigms and like really carefully responding to all the methodological problems. But Davis does the task of trying to get more high-resolution detail about precisely which metaethical positions. So it's not realist, anti-realist. It's like non-cognitivists, error theorists. Now that Pulsler and Wright do that too, but Davis really focuses on breaking things down a bit further. Davis gets very high rates of anti-realism. So basically people that are responding to and improving in the previous literature, you see the anti-realist rates shoot up. Now, I should say, another paper just got published in 2023 where the realist rates are a bit higher in that paper. And that's using different measures. So what we have currently is kind of chaos and it's unclear. Sorry to give so much background, but that's just for my audience as well. But if you want to just see this right in front of your face, there's a particular, did you get the paper, by the way?
I did. Yeah, I found it.
So if you go to page 75, the top of that page.
Oh, I found the, let me see if I can do I have to hit export or something like that? No, that just quotes it. I'm on psychnet.apa.org and it has the abstract and then a citation of it. Okay. Full text from publisher. Let me click download PDF. Give me a second. Ooh, I think I'm there. Okay, I got it.
Cool. All right, I'm going to try to screen share without screwing something up. I'm very goofy at this sort of thing. So let's see.
If you don't get it, I probably can.
I'll try to figure it out later. I don't think it's going to work right now.
I think I can screen share if you want me to real quick.
Go for it. In fact, I could also just give people, I don't know where it is. Okay, go ahead. I don't know if you have.
Share screen. Yep.
You know what? Let's not do that because I'm a little weird on whether we're violating some copyright thing. I don't know if this is.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't want to mess.
It's fine. No worries.
Cool. Okay. But if you look at that, and everybody should be able. In fact, if we have a link to the paper, I'll just send that to people. See if you could get it here. Because I get very excited about this paper. How I critique it. So I put a link in there. But if you go to page 75, do you see that graph there? Or I should say table.
Let me see. Page. I'm almost at page 70, 74, 75. Consistently realist, inconsistent, and then consistently anti-realist. Wow, that's a huge difference. Right? Yeah. So
something funny is going on here. I don't take this to be decisive evidence that most people are anti-realists for a few of the reasons I mentioned, but I also have methodological concerns with this study and other studies. But what's weird is I don't see realists reacting to this by going, oh shit, maybe we're wrong. The reaction is, yeah, it doesn't matter. People are probably realists anyway.
Like, as in they're just denying that this is like a valid study. And what are they doing? They're pointing at the population. They're saying it's just not representative. Don't worry about it.
I haven't seen anybody provide robust criticisms, which isn't to say they haven't or they wouldn't, where they just spend the time looking at the study. And I think a reasonable dose of, yeah, it's one study, who cares? Come back to me in 20 years when you have a big literature. And fair enough to that. I think that's actually a completely reasonable response. Yeah, you got one study. That's not going to tell me anything. And that I think is actually fine. You shouldn't trust one study. But it is a startling finding. What I can say is that the other findings don't get rates that high, but they do get rates that are weird. And what's weird about them is that if you ask people about concrete moral issues, they give realist responses to some questions and anti-realist responses to others. And that's really strange because if they were thinking of them all as moral issues, one might think that someone would have consistent metaethical standards, and yet people don't appear to have consistent metaethical standards. I've never heard of an academic philosopher who says, I'm a relativist about these moral issues and I'm a realist about these moral issues. Wong might be an exception. There's this pluralist relativist position. So there might be one person that I know of that defends a view that could be understood in those terms, but it doesn't seem as piecemeal as this. That's more like you have relativism within bounds. It's not relativism for this little thing and realism for this little thing. That's strange, but that's how people respond to these questions. To me, I take that to be an indication, among other indications, that they're probably not interpreting the questions the way that we're intending for them to interpret them.
Yeah, as in people don't even have this concept of morality as some kind of meta ethic. They just kind of think in siloed issues or something. Yes, murder is always wrong, but something else might not always be always right or wrong.
It could be that. Yeah. So the always wrong right there would be not represent. So realism would be that the person thinks whether or not murder is wrong doesn't depend on the gold standards or values of any individuals or groups. That's what they would have to be understanding it to mean in order for the response to be diagnostic of their metaethical view with respect to realism. But many people might interpret it to be murder is wrong without regard for context. There are no circumstances under which a murder would be permissible. But that's a different distinction. That's actually absolutism versus you could say situation or contextualism or something like that. And that's a different conceptual distinction. That's a normative characteristic of moral principles. So a moral rule you should never steal regardless of context, that's not realism. So, but people will interpret the questions that way. So my work focused on asking people how they interpreted these sorts of questions. And they do not, most of them give answers that seem to indicate either it's not clear whether they interpreted it as about realism or they quite clearly interpreted it to be about something else. But there's other hints. So my favorite hint at this was one that was in a paper by James Beebe. So Beebe had this awesome idea, which is often they compare the moral. So typically the way it works is this. So you get people Alex thinks abortion is morally wrong. Sam thinks abortion is not morally wrong. Do you think Alex and Sam can both be correct? Or do you think at least one of them has to be incorrect? And if they say they're both correct, relativism or anti-realism. If they say at least one has to be incorrect, they're a realist. But typically, the researchers using these studies ask about non-moral questions too. You could think of this as looking at other domains, but you could also think of it as a control group. And so the control group would be like factual questions, like George Washington was born in November. Now, if two people disagree about that, of course, at least one of them has to be incorrect. It's not like he could be born in November and not born in November. That doesn't make sense. That's contradictory. So you ideally, if you ask like factual questions like that, like empirical questions or scientific or mathematical questions, people would always pick at least one person must be incorrect. And if you pick very uncontroversial things like the North Pole is north of the equator, people are going to be like, yeah, if someone disagrees, they're wrong. But what BB did is ask people questions where the two people disagreeing with each other, there's no way for the reader to know what the answer would be. And plausibly, there's not really any way for the people disagreeing to know what the answer would be. So one example would be two people disagree about whether Julius Caesar drank wine on his 21st birthday. Now, we have no way of knowing what the answer to that is. Birthday, Sam thinks Caesar did not drink wine on his 21st birthday. Do you think they could both be correct, or must at least one of them be incorrect? Do you know the results for this?
Is it more split than we would imagine?
How many people do you think would say they could both be correct? Like what percentage?
I imagine that's like something less than 10% would say that Caesar can, like, the two people could be correct that Caesar both did and did not. Like, I'd imagine it's.
But since I'm asking, it's going to be higher.
Right. I'd like to think that it's single digits, like 1 or 2%.
It's 45%.
Whoa, 45.
This was replicated in 4 different cultures: in Poland, Ecuador, China, and the United States. And it was about the same percentage. It's around 45, 50% everywhere.
Okay, so what do we do with it? Like, what?
What do you think is going on there? I have not. So, I have tried to figure out what's going on here and empirically demonstrate it, and my studies have got null results, and I haven't been able to successfully demonstrate it. I'm going to have to put those up somewhere so someone could see how badly null my results are on that. So, I thought I had a good way of testing what's going on here, and it didn't work.
Well, I mean, that's valuable, right? Like, learning what doesn't work is part of science.
But try getting null results published somewhere. I'm
Yeah,
probably have to put them up as a preprint or on a website somewhere.
Fair enough.
So they can make it into a meta-analysis at some point. But okay, here's what I suspect is going on, and this was an idea that, to my knowledge, was initially proposed by some of my, like, at least one of my colleagues, and then I was like, that makes sense. Which is he called it modal operator scope ambiguity. Great. Now I'm getting technical. Okay. I don't want to get too technical, so I try to give standard examples. Okay. Imagine I ask you this. Give me 2 baseball teams.
The Mets and the Yankees.
The Mets and the Angels, you said?
Mets and Yankees, but
Mets and the Yankees. Too. Okay, the Mets and the Yankees. Could the Mets and the Yankees both win the World Series?
No.
Okay, because only one team can win the World Series. Okay, so you go out to dinner, you're with a friend, you look at the menu, you both see something you want to order. What's something you might want to order?
Steak and lobster.
Okay, can you and your friend both order steak and lobster?
Yes.
There you go. So if I said the Yankees and the Mets could both win the World Series, people are going to say no. If I say, can you and your friend both order the steak and lobster? The answer is yes. Why is it that structurally those sentences are pretty much identical, and yet one you give a no and one you give a yes?
Because somebody could interpret the Mets and Yankees question as like, could either of them win? Like, yes, either one could win.
There you go.
Okay.
It's a question where it's about, like, if I say I flip a coin, could it be on heads or tails? Yeah, it could be on one or the other, not both at the same time. And so this is where modal operator scope ambiguity comes in. When you have a statement about X or Y, it can be interpreted as both an inclusive reading, X or Y or both, or an exclusive reading, X or Y, but not both. And typically, when you have background knowledge, that context lets you know. In the case of knowing about the World Series, you know only one team can win, and so it can't be both. You have background knowledge. And in the case of 2 people going to a restaurant, you have background knowledge that 2 people typically can order the same dish. Now, it could be just by chance that there's one of that dish left, and the waiter comes out and says, I'm very sorry, but there's only one left. Does either of you want it? And then the other will have to order something else. That's pretty uncommon. Typically, there's a presumption that if it's on the menu, and it's not crossed out or something, or the person serving you says we're out of this, then it's inclusive that you could both have it. So you get that issue where background knowledge typically fleshes it out. Now, in this case, what is going on here? Well, they don't have the background knowledge of an inclusive reading, and so an exclusive reading actually kind of makes sense. That you're asking, could Alex or Sam, one or the other, turn out to be correct? That's actually a reasonable interpretation, but it's a weird question. It's ambiguous. And so it could be some people interpret it that way, some people interpret it the other way. It's not clearly, like, the ambiguity isn't resolved by background knowledge. And so this is something that I think, and this generalizes, this is not just a problem for this type of paradigm. Psychologists and philosophers alike seem to forget how language works in the real world. In the real world, your background knowledge is actually relevant to interpreting the meaning of what someone says. And so what researchers will do is they'll take a sentence structure and they'll like take some unit, like the moral statement, they swap it out for Caesar drinking wine, and they'll swap out like abortion for that. And then the rest of it, Alex and Sam disagree. Alex thinks this, Sam thinks this. And yet, in one context, people will interpret it in an inclusive way, because the type of question you're asking about actually changes the context of the question. You can't just rigidly. So basically what I'm saying is psychologists and philosophers alike forget that meaning isn't entirely a matter of like syntax and sentence structure. It's context.
So could a study be very carefully worded such that the results are going to like suffer from far less ambiguity than a less carefully worded study?
Yes. And that's what Polzer and Wright try to do in that study. Okay. And then they have another study. Some of the stuff they do is to what I call these training paradigms. And what you'll see if you read that paper is they're very concerned about ambiguities like these, potentially misleading participants and confusing them and getting them to interpret questions in ways that researchers don't want. So give them a little instruction first, train them in the concepts first, test them on those concepts, make sure they get it. That just runs up against another problem. Do you know what that problem is?
Are we like priming them almost at this point?
That's possible. So it's possible that if there's biasing factors in your instructions, you're pushing them systematically towards one response, one pattern of responses rather than another. And so you're sort of, it's like leading the witness. That's a possibility. Yes. But that's not the one that I have in mind. That is a concern though.
What's the one that's in your mind? So
when we are conducting these studies, our goal is to find out whether people without philosophical training are realists or anti-realists. So can we find that out by giving them philosophical training?
Oh, no. We're changing our demographic from people who don't have any philosophical training to people who have some philosophical training.
Right. And so now you're not studying the target population.
That's right.
Tough shit. Your results don't generalize at all. So, you know, this is like running a study where you're like, hey, we want only participants that have never been to Tokyo. Okay, I want to sign up. I've never been to Tokyo. Great. So we're going to get you a ticket. You fly out to Tokyo. You spend a couple weeks here and then come in for the survey. That's a ridiculous way to run that study. So you can't survey how non-philosophers think by training them to be philosophers. But someone might say, okay, but it's not that much training. Okay, so was it good enough for it to work? Because if you're telling me the training sucked, then it wasn't successful. And now I don't trust the results. If you're telling me the training worked, then it was successful. And maybe we could get people to be junior philosophers in 20 minutes. Fine. Either way, the results are either, it's not clear they're valid because we don't know if the participants interpreting the questions as intended, or they are interpreting them as intended because you train them to, and now they're not a layperson. So it's a catch-22. There's no way to get out of this.
We're never going to be able to get answers from people who have no philosophical training that are reflective of people who have some baseline level of philosophical training, because
why do you think I call,
true.
Right. Why do you think I call the paper's title Schrodinger's categories? That's why it's called that. We're in deep shit in experimental philosophy if we're trying to figure out what people think about philosophical questions prior to philosophical training. Prior to philosophical training, we have very good reason to believe, I think from my evidence and some evidence from others as well, that people are just not going to interpret the philosophical questions the way you intend. It would be like if you started hitting me with like a quiz about like esoteric Catholic doctrine. I'm just going to go, I don't know, or I'll guess. I'm just not going to know any of the answers. So you could train me in Catholic doctrine. Like the only way I can answer the questions is if I like finish some like Catholic theology school. Fine, now I can answer your questions. But if your goal was to figure out how I thought about Catholic doctrine prior to training in Catholic theology, how the hell is that going to tell? So you could at that point ask me, well, what did you think beforehand? But memory is not that reliable. So yeah, I think this is a serious problem. And I think people haven't woken up and noticed we got a problem here, which is that it might be that one of the central tasks of experimental philosophy is not, we can't pursue it.
And that that sucks. like it's a losing proposition from the start.
So I think that I don't want to give up hope. What I think is probably the case is that survey methods are probably not adequate. And so there's a great paper. I'm going to have to close things out. So I'm going to give you a final word after I make a couple points, because probably I should have been out of here a while ago. Okay, so there's this great paper called The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy by Kauppinen back from 2007. And in that paper, Kauppinen basically raises very similar issues, but from an analytic philosophy perspective that's very critical of XFI, whereas I want to like rescue XFI. So that, I mean, it's called The Rise and Fall of XFI. So that paper basically says, look, philosophers don't care about like untutored responses to questions because we don't know what the hell those responses are a response to. We don't know if they're understanding the question. They haven't thought about it. They're not free of biasing factors and pragmatic considerations in the way you're framing the question. So if we want a response to the pure semantics, exactly what we intend to convey by the, we would need to be confident that those distortions aren't present. So how are you going to be confident about that in an untrained population? Well, surveys are probably just not going to get the job done because you need to meet these conditions. You need to check the boxes that they're competent in the language, that they meet the right conditions. So how would you get them to do that? Kauppinen says, engage in philosophical dialogue. And now the person's a philosopher. Good job. But just the point there is that I think you could chart a middle course, which is just either do philosophy or do surveys, which is something closer to interviewing and something closer to anthropological research. Is basically do qualitative research, really talk to people, sit down and talk to them.
Yeah.
And record it and transcribe it. And that's, I think, would be a fantastic way to gather data on how people without philosophical training think about philosophy, is to record the whole process.
And it's a lot more work, but I mean, hey, if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes, right?
Right. And people, I think a lot of quantitative psychologists kind of sneer at qualitative methods. They see them as like soft and mushy. It's, oh, you're not even going to give me a p-value. That's not real data. So that's kind of goofy. Anyway, that's my spiel on that. Sorry, we deviated from like stuff. So
no, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I guess I'll end just by maybe telling people where they can find me and stuff, I guess.
Yep. I mentioned your channel in there, and I'll add it to the description as well.
Oh, thank you.
Can I like at you in the title of the video?
That'd be awesome. Yeah, that'd be super cool.
Okay,
if you
I'll
did.
do all that. But go ahead and do your thing, and then we'll close out.
So, and I guess first, let me just say thank you so much for having me on. This conversation was a while coming. I meant to do it earlier. This is all me, having scheduling problems, but I'm really glad that we had this opportunity to talk. Your work was very formative, like for me, I guess 8 to 10 months ago and all that. And I think that a lot of like your opinions are reflected in some of the videos that I've done, like when I, have philosophical discussions with other Catholics. And I often refer Catholics to you when they'll say things like when they're super incredulous about moral anti-realism. I'll often say, you got to take a look at the work of Dr. Lance Bush. Like he makes it seem a lot less incredulous than you might think that it is right now. But that is what I do. I talk to Catholics. So I kind of view my YouTube channel. I hope for it in some ways to be like a de-radicalization center almost, because there's like a radicalization going on right now in Catholic culture where a lot of Catholics are kind of turning back to the 1950s and, before the Second Vatican Council. And I think it's really dangerous. And I don't think that a lot of Catholics and ex-Catholics are talking to each other. So that's kind of what I do over on my channel. I try to have conversations with Catholics, as well as with ex-Catholics who've been hurt by the church and stuff like that. So if you're an ex-Catholic, if you're a Catholic, or if you're just somebody who kind of finds that stuff interesting, you can find me on YouTube at Kevin Non-Tradicath. That is my legal birth last name. I did not make that up. No, my last name's O'Connor. But on YouTube, I'm Kevin Non-Tradicath. So, Dr. Lance Bush, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. This was a lot of fun. I was having a rough time with this stream, and this made it into something that ran for another almost 3 hours again. So that's a good thing.
Good, good.
All right, take care, and I guess I'll talk to you later. And I'll do
Adios.
the outro video for everybody here. So see you later. All right, everyone. I'm going to close it out there. I don't see a bunch of questions in there, so we're just going to do outro video. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, go check out Kevin's channel, do all the things, leave comments in the comment section. I like to engage with people, so do all the stuff. All right. See y'all later.